Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most shocking secrets. A medieval custom so intimate, so uncomfortable that it would make even the most open-minded modern person blush. Imagine your wedding night, the most private moment of your life, but you are not alone. Your family is there, your friends are there, the priest is there. Sometimes dozens of witnesses crowd into your bedroom and they are not leaving until they are absolutely certain you have done what newlyweds are supposed to do. This was not a nightmare. This was normal. This was the bedding ceremony, and for hundreds of years across medieval Europe, almost no one could escape it. Before we dive deeper into this fascinating story, I have a small request. If you are curious about history's strangest customs, if you love learning about how people really lived in the past, not the sanitized fairy tale version, then please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Your support genuinely helps me continue bringing you these stories, and I am always curious. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. I read every single one and I love hearing from you. Now, let us dim those lights, get comfortable under your blankets, maybe turn on a soft fan for that gentle white noise, and let us step back in time together to discover why medieval people thought your wedding night needed an audience. Picture this. It is November 14th, 1501. St. Paul's Cathedral in London blazes with candlelight packed with nobility in their finest silks and velvets. At the altar stands 15-year-old Prince Arthur Tudor, heir to the English throne, dressed head to toe in white satin. Down the elevated platform that runs the entire length of the cathedral walks his bride, Princess Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. She too wears white, a colour so unusual for brides at that time that the crowd gasps. Her reddish gold hair falls below her hips. Her veil cannot hide the anxiety in her eyes. The wedding ceremony itself is magnificent, exactly what you would expect for a prince and princess. Archbishop Henry Dean conducts the service with all the pomp and solemnity befitting such an important political alliance. When Arthur lifts Catherine's veil for the first time, he sees the girl he has been writing letters to in Latin for years, letters formal and polite because these two barely know each other. After the ceremony, there is a feast at Baynard's Castle. The best singers in England perform. Elaborate dishes parade past on golden platters. Nobles toast the young couple's health and happiness. Wine flows freely. Everyone celebrates. But as the evening wears on, Catherine's ladies-in-waiting begin to exchange knowing glances. The gentlemen surrounding Arthur start to smirk and nudge each other, because everyone in that room knows what comes next, and it is not going to be private. What follows has been carefully choreographed by the Arthur's grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who has written down detailed ordinances for this exact moment. First, the bed itself must be prepared. The Earl of Oxford, one of the most important nobles in England, personally tests the royal bed by laying down on it, rolling from one side to the other, checking that nothing protrudes from the mattress that could harm the prince and his bride. Think about that for a moment. A grown man, a powerful earl, is lying on the bed where two teenagers are about to spend their wedding night, making sure it is comfortable enough. Once he approves, a bishop sprinkles the bed with holy water, blessing it in the name of God. Then comes the separation. Catherine is led away from the feast by her ladies-in-waiting. They take her to a separate chamber where they undress her, slowly removing each layer of her elaborate wedding gown, her undergarments, everything until she stands naked. They place a veil over her face and a nightgown on her body. Meanwhile, in another room, Arthur's gentlemen do the same for him. They strip him down, place him in a simple nightshirt with a gown cast loosely about him. Can you imagine how these two teenagers must have felt? Catherine, far from home in a country where she barely speaks the language, about to face the most intimate moment of her life with a boy she has known for 10 days. Arthur, small for his age, described by contemporaries as having an unhealthy skin colour, probably terrified despite all his princely training. Now comes the procession. The sound of viols and tabors, medieval string and percussion instruments, fills the corridors as Catherine is escorted to the bedchamber. Arthur is led there separately by his gentlemen. Both groups converge at the bedroom door, and suddenly this intimate space becomes very, very crowded. Family members, friends, nobles, church officials, they all file in. Someone hands the trembling couple a cup of benediction posset, a drink of sweetened and spiced wine that has been blessed by the priest. They drink it together while dozens of eyes watch their every move, every sip, every nervous glance, every trembling hand. Then, according to tradition, the groomsmen and bridesmaids sit on opposite sides of the bed. The couple is placed between the sheets, reverently, the official record says, as if that word makes this any less mortifying. And then begins what was called the divination custom of throwing the stocking. The attendants have taken the stockings that Arthur and Catherine wore earlier. Now, sitting with their backs to the centre of the bed, they take turns throwing these stockings over their shoulders at the newlyweds. If a groomsman hits Catherine or if a bridesmaid hits Arthur, superstition says that thrower will be the next to marry. So picture this scene. You're 15 years old, lying in bed in your nightclothes next to someone you barely know, and your relatives are pelting you with hosiery while making bawdy jokes and laughing uproariously. Finally, mercifully, the curtains around the bed are drawn. The crowd retreats. Arthur and Catherine are left alone at last. But here is the thing that we need to understand. For Prince Arthur and Princess Catherine, this was actually one of the more discreet bedding ceremonies of medieval Europe. They got privacy for the actual intimate act. In other parts of Europe, in other circumstances, that privacy did not exist at all. In some Scandinavian weddings, witnesses would literally stay in the room. In Iceland, the marriage was not considered legally valid unless at least 6 men witnessed the couple in bed together. 6 men watching. Now I know what you are thinking. You're thinking, what on earth were these people thinking? How could anyone consider this normal? And that is exactly the question we need to explore tonight. Because the bedding ceremony was not about voyeurism or perversion. It was about something that medieval people took incredibly seriously. Proof. You see, in our modern world, when 2 people get married, they sign some papers, maybe say some vows, and that is it. The marriage is legal. Done. But in medieval Europe, marriage was not just a romantic union. It was a legal contract, a property transfer, a political alliance, and potentially the foundation for inheritance of land, titles, and power. And like any important contract, it needed to be witnessed and proven. The consummation, that is, the couple's first sexual intercourse, was not just a private, intimate moment. It was the final seal on the marriage contract. Without it, the marriage could be annulled, declared invalid as if it never happened. This was especially crucial for royal and noble families. If a princess married a prince but they never consummated the marriage, either party could potentially void the entire arrangement. Think about what that meant politically. Imagine Spain and England making a huge alliance through Arthur and Catherine's marriage, with treaties signed, dowries paid, armies potentially pledged to support each other, and then the marriage gets annulled because no one could prove it was consummated. The international implications would be staggering. So the bedding ceremony existed to create witnesses, people who could stand up in court if necessary and say, yes, I was there, I saw them go to bed together as husband and wife, the marriage was completed. In England, this usually meant witnessing the couple entering the bed together and then leaving them in privacy. But the legal systems in other parts of Europe were even more strict, even more invasive. In Iceland, as I mentioned, you needed 6 male witnesses minimum. Not 5, not 7, exactly 6. And they needed to actually see the couple in the bed together, not just hear that they were in there somewhere. In many Swedish provinces during the medieval period, the bedding ceremony was not considered optional or traditional. It was required by law for the marriage to be complete. Without it, you were not legally married, no matter what vows you had said in church, no matter what papers you had signed. The Swedish legal code spelled it out explicitly. Public bedding was essential. Later, royal decrees modified this requirement, but for hundreds of years, Swedish couples had no choice. Your wedding night was going to have witnesses, whether you liked it or not, and here is where it gets even more complicated. In Scotland, the rules were different, but somehow even more chaotic. Scottish law said that marriage was formed by simple consent. You did not even need a church ceremony or consummation for the marriage to be valid. And yet bedding rituals were widespread throughout Scotland anyway. Why? Because people wanted that extra layer of certainty. They wanted someone to see them in bed together, just in case questions arose later. But Scotland's bedding ceremonies were described as unstructured, which I think is a polite historical way of saying they were a bit of a free-for-all. The weirdest part: there are documented cases where a couple who was not married could be forced into marriage if someone stumbled upon them in bed together. That person, just some random witness, could pronounce them husband and wife on the spot. Talk about pressure. But let us return to Arthur and Catherine for a moment, because their story does not have a happy ending. After that elaborate wedding, after that uncomfortable bedding ceremony, they were sent to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border. Arthur was supposed to govern Wales from there. They'd barely been married 6 months when both of them fell seriously ill in March of 1502. Catherine survived. Arthur did not. He died on April 2nd, 1502, at just 15 years old. And then something fascinating happened that shows us exactly why the bedding ceremony mattered so much. Catherine insisted, for the rest of her life, that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She claimed she came to her second husband, Arthur's younger brother, who became King Henry VIII, as a virgin. But there were witnesses from that wedding night. There were people who had been in that room, who had watched the couple being put to bed together. Years later, when Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine, his lawyers would use those witnesses to argue that her marriage to Arthur had been consummated, making her marriage to Henry invalid under church law, which forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow if that first marriage had been consummated. One of the most poignant witnesses they tried to find was a woman named Catalina of Motril, who had been Catherine's enslaved servant. Catalina was the one who made the bed, who prepared the chamber, who attended to what the Spanish sources delicately called other secret services of Her Highness's chamber. If anyone knew the truth about what happened, or did not happen, between Arthur and Catherine that night, it would have been Catalina. The Spanish searched for her testimony desperately in 1531, 30 years after that wedding night. Think about that. A woman's entire life, a king's claim to annul his marriage, international relations between England and Spain, all potentially hinging on what some witnesses saw or thought they saw on one November night in 1501. This is why medieval people took the bedding ceremony so seriously. It was not just tradition. It was not just entertainment for bored nobles. It was legal protection, political insurance, and social validation all rolled into one deeply uncomfortable custom. The ceremony created a paper trail, or rather a witness trail. It meant that if anyone ever questioned whether a marriage was real, whether it had been completed properly, whether heirs born from that union were legitimate, there were people who could testify. They had been there. They had seen it. Case closed. But weddings like Arthur and Catherine's, royal weddings with all their elaborate protocols, represent only one version of the bedding ceremony. Across medieval Europe, this custom took countless forms, varying by country, by social class, by time period, by local tradition. Some versions were solemn and religious. Others were raucous parties that would make a modern bachelor party look tame. Some focused on fertility symbols and ancient superstitions. Others were purely about legal documentation. And as we will discover, the experience of a royal couple like Arthur and Catherine was vastly different from what a peasant couple in a village or a merchant family in a growing city might go through on their wedding night. The bedding ceremony reveals something profound about how differently medieval people thought about marriage, about privacy, about the relationship between the individual and the community. They lived in a world where almost nothing was truly private, where your neighbours knew your business, where the walls of your home were thin, where extended families often shared living spaces. The idea that your wedding night should be completely private, that no one should know anything about your intimate life, that is a modern concept, and a relatively recent one at that. So as we continue this journey tonight through the strange, fascinating, sometimes disturbing world of medieval bedding ceremonies, I want you to try something. Try to set aside your modern sensibilities for a moment. Try not to judge these people by our standards. Instead, let us try to understand their world, their fears, their needs, their logic. Because once we do that, the bedding ceremony starts to make a strange kind of sense. It was uncomfortable, yes. It was invasive by our standards, absolutely. But in a world without photography, without video, without reliable written records accessible to common people, without modern notions of privacy, in that world, having witnesses to important life events was how you proved things happened. It was how you protected yourself legally. It was how you ensured that contracts were honoured and that no one could later claim ignorance or deception. And now that we understand why this custom existed, why medieval people considered it necessary despite its obvious discomfort, we are ready to go deeper. In the next part of our story, we will explore the specific laws that made bedding ceremonies not just traditional, but legally required in many places. We will look at cases where marriages were annulled, where lives were destroyed, where fortunes were lost, all because of what did or did not happen during a bedding ceremony. We will discover just how seriously medieval legal systems took this requirement, and what happened to people who tried to avoid it. The year is 1450, somewhere in rural Iceland. A young woman stands before a group of village elders, her face pale, her hands trembling. She is trying to prove that she is married. Her husband, or the man she thought was her husband, has abandoned her, and now he claims they were never properly wed. She describes the ceremony, the vows, the feast, but the elders shake their heads. One question hangs in the cold Icelandic air. Who witnessed your bedding? She cannot name 6 men. She can name 4, maybe 5, but not 6. And in Iceland, under the law codes that have governed this island for centuries, that is not enough. Without 6 male witnesses to the bedding, her marriage is not valid. She is not a wife. She is nothing. Any children she might bear will be illegitimate. Any property she thought she would inherit, gone. Her entire future has just been destroyed because she could not produce the right number of witnesses to what should have been her most private moment. This is not a story about romance or tradition. This is a story about law, cold, specific, unforgiving medieval law. And across Europe, from the frozen north to the Mediterranean coast, that law had some very particular things to say about what needed to happen on your wedding night, and who needed to be there to see it. Let us start with Iceland, because their laws about bedding ceremonies were perhaps the most precise and the most strict in all of medieval Europe. Iceland was settled by Norse Vikings starting in the 870s, and they brought with them a fierce devotion to law and order. They had no king, no central authority. Instead, they governed themselves through an elaborate legal code called Gragas, or Grey Goose. And buried within the provisions of Gragas, amid laws about sheep grazing and blood feuds and property boundaries, were very specific requirements about marriage. According to Icelandic law, a marriage was only valid, only legal, only binding, if it included a bedding ritual that was witnessed by at least 6 men, not women, not 5 men and a woman, 6 men specifically. They had to see the couple in bed together, not just see them walk toward a bedroom, not just hear that they were somewhere in a house, actually see them together in the marital bed. Can you imagine being a newlywed in medieval Iceland, knowing that if you could not produce 6 male witnesses, your entire marriage could be invalidated? Knowing that your spouse could potentially walk away from you years later, claiming the marriage never happened, simply because you did not have enough men watching you on your wedding night. This was not theoretical. This actually happened to people. Icelandic sagas and legal documents from the period record disputes where marriages were annulled, where women were left destitute, where children were declared illegitimate, all because the bedding ceremony had not been witnessed properly. Think about the power that gave to those 6 men. They were not just guests at your wedding. They were the living proof of your marriage's validity. If they later decided to lie, to claim they were not there or did not witness what they witnessed, they could destroy your entire life. And if you could not get 6 men to agree to be witnesses in the first place, maybe because you were poor, maybe because your family had enemies, maybe because you married against your family's wishes, then your marriage could never be fully legal under Icelandic law. Now, you might wonder, why 6? Why not 5 or 7? Why men specifically? The historical sources do not give us a clear answer, but scholars believe it relates to older Norse concepts of witnessing and oath-taking. In many Norse legal traditions, important transactions required multiple witnesses to prevent fraud. 6 seems to have been considered a sufficiently reliable number, enough that collusion would be difficult, but not so many that finding witnesses would be impossible. As for requiring men, well, medieval Iceland was a deeply patriarchal society. Men were considered the legitimate witnesses in legal matters. Women could participate in many aspects of Icelandic society. They could own property, they could divorce their husbands, but when it came to legal witnessing, particularly for something as important as marriage validation, the law demanded men. But Iceland was not alone in treating bedding ceremonies as legal requirements. Let us travel south to Sweden. In many Swedish provinces during the medieval period, the law was equally clear. Public bedding was essential to the completion of a marriage. The old Swedish provincial laws, documents like Västgötalagen and Östgötalagen, spelled it out explicitly. Until the bedding had taken place with proper witnesses, the marriage was incomplete. You could have the church ceremony. You could exchange vows before a priest. You could sign contracts and exchange property. But legally, you were not fully married until the bedding had been witnessed. The Swedish approach was slightly different from Iceland's. In Sweden, the emphasis was less on a specific number of witnesses and more on the public nature of the ceremony itself. The bedding needed to be a known, acknowledged community event. In many Swedish villages, it was the most distinguished guest at the wedding, often the village headman or a local noble, who had the honour of leading the bride to bed in a festive procession. Everyone in the village would know about it. Everyone would see the procession. There could be no doubt, no later claims of, "Oh, we did not know they actually went through with it." Interestingly, as Sweden became more centralised under royal authority in the later medieval period, new royal laws began to diminish the legal importance of bedding ceremonies. Kings wanted to standardise marriage law across their realm, and having different requirements in every province was messy. So gradually, The absolute legal requirement for public bedding was relaxed. But here is the fascinating part. Even after the laws changed, even after it was no longer strictly required, people kept doing it anyway. Because by that point, it was not just about law. It was about tradition, about community validation, about the feeling that your marriage was not quite real until everyone knew it had been consummated. Now let us head west to Scotland, where the legal situation was almost comically chaotic, if it were not so serious for the people involved. Scottish marriage law in the medieval period was incredibly flexible compared to the rest of Europe. According to Scots law, marriage was formed by simple consent between two people. That is it. You did not need a church ceremony. You did not need a priest. You did not need witnesses. You did not even need consummation. If two people of legal age agreed to marry each other, even just verbally, even in private, they were married. Period. You would think this flexibility would make bedding ceremonies unnecessary in Scotland, right? Wrong. Bedding rituals were actually widespread throughout Scotland, precisely because the law was so loose. People wanted that extra layer of proof. They wanted witnesses who could testify that yes, this couple was truly married, truly committed. So Scottish couples would arrange bedding ceremonies even though the law did not require them. But Scottish bedding ceremonies were described by contemporary sources as unstructured. There was no standard protocol, no specific number of witnesses required, no official procedure. People just wanted someone, anyone, to see them in bed together. And this led to some truly bizarre situations. Because if just being seen in bed together was enough to prove marriage in the eyes of the community, then conversely, being caught in bed together could be used as proof that you were married even if you did not want to be. There are documented cases from medieval Scotland where an unmarried couple was found in bed together. Maybe they were having an affair, maybe it was a prearranged elopement, maybe someone set them up, and a witness could literally pronounce them husband and wife on the spot, just like that, instant marriage. No ceremony, no consent even, just someone walking in and saying, "I declare you married," because you were in bed together. Think about how that could be weaponized. If you wanted to force someone into marrying you, or if you wanted to trap someone into a union they did not want, all you had to do was get them into bed, or get them caught in a situation that looked like they were in bed together, with a witness present. Suddenly you had a marriage, whether both parties wanted one or not. It is a chilling example of how laws designed to protect people, laws meant to validate marriages and ensure they could not be easily broken, could be twisted into tools of coercion. Let us take a moment to travel south to England, where the legal situation was more formalised but no less serious. In medieval England, marriage was regulated by church law, which said that marriage was created by the exchange of vows. Once you said your vows before a priest, you were married in the eyes of God and the church, but, and this is crucial, the marriage could still be annulled if it was never consummated. Annulment meant the marriage was declared invalid from the beginning as if it had never existed. This was different from divorce, which acknowledged that a valid marriage had existed but was now being ended. Annulment said, no, this marriage was never real. And the primary grounds for annulment? Non-consummation. If a marriage was never consummated, either party could petition for annulment. This is why bedding ceremonies mattered so much in England, even though English law did not specify exact numbers of witnesses or strict procedures. The bedding ceremony created witnesses who could testify that the couple had gone to bed together as husband and wife, making any later claim of non-consummation much harder to prove. Without those witnesses, you were vulnerable. Your spouse could claim years later that the marriage had never been consummated, and if there were no witnesses to contradict that claim, the marriage could be annulled. There is a fascinating case recorded in British legal documents where a marriage was annulled on the grounds that the bride had run away within 15 minutes of the bedding ritual. 15 minutes. The couple had been put to bed together, the ceremony had begun, but before it could be completed, before consummation could happen, the bride fled. Maybe she was terrified. Maybe she had never wanted the marriage. Maybe something about that moment, the reality of what was about to happen, was too much for her. Whatever the reason, she ran, and because witnesses could testify that she had left before consummation, the marriage was annulled. Her brief time in that bed, witnessed by others, became the evidence that proved the marriage had never been completed. Or consider another case equally revealing a clandestine marriage, one performed in secret without family knowledge or community awareness, was made public only when the pregnant wife shared her husband's deathbed. She was carrying his child about to give birth, but no one knew they were married because they'd kept it secret. On his deathbed, with witnesses present, the husband acknowledged the marriage and the coming child as legitimate. Those witnesses, including presumably medical attendants and family members, then testified that they had been told by a dying man that this woman was his legal wife. The pregnancy served as proof that consummation had occurred. Without those deathbed witnesses, that woman and her child would have had no legal standing, no claim to the husband's property, no legitimacy at all. These cases show us something important. Bedding ceremonies were not really about sex. They were about proof. They were about creating a public record, a human record, of what had happened. In a world before modern documentation, before photographs or video, or even widespread literacy, how do you prove that something happened? You have witnesses, reliable witnesses, multiple witnesses, witnesses who saw with their own eyes and could testify under oath. And this was especially crucial because of what was at stake. Marriage was not just about love or companionship, it was about property. In medieval Europe, marriage was the primary mechanism for transferring wealth from one generation to the next. When a woman married, her dowry, the property or money her family gave with her, became part of the marital estate. When a man married, his wife gained certain rights to his property, particularly the right of dower, which meant she could claim a portion of his estate if he died. Children born within the marriage were legitimate heirs who could inherit property, titles, and status. But here is the critical point. All of this depended on the marriage being valid. An invalid marriage meant no legitimate heirs. It meant property that should have gone to a wife or children instead went to other relatives. It meant dowries that had to be returned. It meant political alliances that collapsed. For royal and noble families, this could mean the difference between peace and war. For peasant families, it could mean the difference between survival and destitution. So when you understand that marriage was fundamentally a property transaction, a legal contract with massive implications for inheritance and social standing, the bedding ceremony starts to make more sense. It was uncomfortable, yes. It was invasive, absolutely. But it was also the most reliable way medieval society had to prove that a marriage had been completed according to the requirements of law and custom. Those witnesses were not there to gawk or to violate privacy. They were there to serve as living proof, human documentation of a legal transaction that would affect families and property for generations. And this brings us to perhaps the most important point about medieval bedding ceremony law: enforcement. Because laws mean nothing if they are not enforced, if people do not actually follow them. And medieval Europe had some very interesting ways of ensuring that bedding ceremonies happened, and happened properly. In communities where bedding was legally required, social pressure was immense. If you tried to skip the ceremony, rumours would start. People would whisper. Your marriage might be considered suspect. Other families might refuse to do business with you. In some cases, church officials would refuse to record the marriage or grant certain rights to the couple until they received testimony from witnesses about the bedding. But there was also positive incentive. Participating in someone else's bedding ceremony as a witness gave you status. It meant you were trusted, respected, considered reliable enough to provide legal testimony if needed. For common people, being asked to witness a bedding ceremony was an honour. It meant the couple valued your presence and your word. And for the couple themselves, having prestigious witnesses, a local lord, a wealthy merchant, a church official, added legitimacy and status to their marriage. The better your witnesses, the more unimpeachable your marriage became. So we can see that across medieval Europe, from Iceland to Scotland to England and beyond, bedding ceremonies were not just quaint traditions, they were legal necessities woven into the fabric of how marriage worked as an institution. The specific requirements varied: 6 witnesses here, public processions there, simple consent somewhere else. But the underlying principle remained the same. Marriage needed to be proven, and consummation was the final proof. Without witnesses to that consummation, or at least to the couple entering the marital bed together with clear intent, the marriage remained vulnerable to challenge, to annulment, to being erased as if it had never been. And now, having understood the cold, hard legal reasons why bedding ceremonies existed, we are ready to see what they actually looked like when royalty was involved. Because if you thought the legal requirements were intense, wait until you see what happened when kings and queens and princes and princesses got married. The pageantry, the protocols, the sheer spectacle of royal bedding ceremonies took this already uncomfortable custom and amplified it into something truly extraordinary and extraordinarily invasive. Let us step inside palaces and see how the powerful performed their wedding nights under the watchful eyes of courts, countries, and history itself. When King Charles II of England drew back the bed curtains himself with his own royal hands to reveal his niece and nephew lying together in their marriage bed, when he did this in front of assembled courtiers, ambassadors, and nobles, he was not being scandalous or inappropriate by the standards of his time. He was performing his duty. The year was 1607, the couple was Princess Mary of England and Prince William of Orange. And what happened in that bedroom was not just a family matter. It was a matter of state. Because when royalty married, their wedding night became political theatre, diplomatic proof, and dynastic insurance all rolled into one very public, very uncomfortable performance. If you thought the legal requirements we explored were invasive, the reality of royal bedding ceremonies took that invasion and transformed it into grand spectacle. Imagine not just having witnesses, but having those witnesses be kings, queens, ambassadors from foreign courts, high-ranking nobles and church officials. Imagine your bedroom being prepared like a stage set, with every detail choreographed, every moment laden with political significance. Imagine knowing that what happens, or does not happen, in that bed tonight could affect international relations, military alliances, the stability of kingdoms. That was the reality for royal newlyweds throughout medieval and early modern Europe. Let us begin with what might be the most elaborate, most documented royal bedding ceremony of all, the marriage of King James IV of Scotland to Princess Margaret Tudor of England in 1503. This was not just any wedding. This was the union that was supposed to end centuries of warfare between Scotland and England. Margaret was the daughter of King Henry VII of England. Yes, the same Henry who had arranged his son Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon 2 years earlier. James was the Scottish king, powerful and ambitious. Their marriage was a peace treaty wrapped in silken ceremony. The wedding itself took place at Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh on August 8, 1503. The celebrations lasted for days. Tournaments, feasts, theatrical performances. Scotland spared no expense to impress the English delegation. But everyone knew that the marriage was not truly sealed until the bedding ceremony. And when that moment came, it was witnessed by some of the most important people in both kingdoms. Scottish lords and ladies on one side, English nobles on the other, all crammed into the royal bedchamber to watch their 13-year-old princess and her 30-year-old king being put to bed together. Can you imagine being 13 years old, far from home? Margaret had travelled for weeks to reach Scotland, surrounded by strangers speaking with accents you could barely understand, and now, being undressed and placed in bed while dozens of powerful adults watched. Contemporary accounts describe Margaret as handling the situation with remarkable composure and dignity. She understood, even at 13, that her body and her wedding night were not really her own. They belonged to the alliance between two kingdoms. The witnesses were not there for her, they were there for England and Scotland. The formal witnesses signed documents afterward, official testimony that the royal couple had been properly bedded. These documents still exist in archives. They are remarkable things to read. Dry legal language describing one of the most intimate moments of two people's lives reduced to bureaucratic proof. On this day we the undersigned witnessed, and then a list of names, some of the most powerful people in Britain, all confirming that yes, they had seen the king and his young queen in their marital bed. These documents could be, and sometimes were, used later as evidence in disputes over succession, legitimacy, or the validity of treaties that hinged on the marriage alliance. But Scotland was not unique in this practice. Let us cross the North Sea to Sweden in 1654, where something even more elaborate was about to unfold. King Charles X Gustav of Sweden was marrying Hedvig Eleonora of Holstein-Gottorp, a German princess. This was a major diplomatic coup for Sweden, which was at the height of its power as a European military force. The wedding was designed to showcase Swedish might and magnificence, and the bedding ceremony? It was turned into something approaching a theatrical production. The ceremony was documented in extraordinary detail by a court artist named Jürgen Ovens, who created paintings and drawings of the event. What they show us is remarkable. First, the bed itself was not just a bed. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship specially commissioned for the occasion. The headboard was carved and gilded. The canopy, called a ciel de lit in French court terminology, was made of the finest fabrics, embroidered with the royal arms of both Sweden and Holstein-Gottorp. The bed curtains were thick velvet lined with silk. The mattress itself had been tested for comfort and safety. Nothing was left to chance. On the wedding night, a formal procession led the bride to the bedchamber. And who led this procession? The Mayor of Stockholm himself, not a family member, not a lady-in-waiting. The Mayor, representing the city and the civil authority of the realm. Behind him came the bride, dressed in an elaborate nightgown that had been blessed by church officials. Behind her came noble ladies, each carrying some item needed for the ceremony: pillows, blankets, a cup for the benediction drink. The whole parade moved through the palace corridors while musicians played solemn wedding music. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, a similar procession was forming for the groom. Male nobles surrounded Charles X Gustav, preparing him for bed. Once both processions converged at the bedchamber, the real ceremony began. But here is what is fascinating about the Swedish royal bedding. It incorporated elements that went far beyond simple witnessing. There were symbolic gifts presented to the couple. Dishes of special foods were offered, fruits meant to symbolize fertility, honeyed wine for sweetness in the marriage, bread for prosperity. The couple had to eat a small amount of each while the assembled nobles watched. Every gesture had meaning. Every food item represented a wish or a blessing for the marriage. And then, because this was a royal wedding with international implications, there were the ambassadors. Diplomatic representatives from Denmark, from Poland, from various German states, from France, they were all there, crowded into that bedchamber, officially witnessing that yes, Sweden's king had married his German princess properly, completely. Their presence made the marriage not just a Swedish event, but a recognised fact of international relations. When they returned to their home countries and reported what they had witnessed, the marriage became real in the courts of Europe. Now, you might be wondering, did all these witnesses actually see the intimate act? The answer is usually no, but sometimes yes. In most Western European royal bedding ceremonies, the witnesses saw the couple being placed in bed together, watched them drink the ceremonial wine, observed the curtains being drawn, and then they left. The actual consummation happened in private, but the witnesses could testify that the couple had gone to bed together with every intention of consummating the marriage, and that was considered sufficient proof. However, and this is where it gets even more uncomfortable, there were exceptions. When there was particular doubt about a groom's ability to perform, or when political stakes were extraordinarily high, witnesses might remain in the room. They would not watch directly. Usually they would stand behind the bed curtains or in an adjoining space, but they would listen. They would wait for sounds that indicated consummation had occurred, and in the morning there would be what was delicately called inspection of the sheets. This inspection was performed by senior noblewomen, usually the Queen's ladies-in-waiting or the bride's female relatives. They would examine the bed linens for blood, which was believed, incorrectly as we now know, to always occur when a virgin had sex for the first time. If they found bloodstains, these would sometimes be displayed publicly, hung from a window or presented to witnesses as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. If they found no blood, questions might be raised. Was the bride not a virgin? Had the marriage not been consummated? The lack of blood could become a scandal, could threaten the validity of the marriage, could raise doubts about any children born later. There is a particularly poignant example of this from France. When King Louis XVI married Marie Antoinette in 1770, admittedly this is a bit later than the medieval period, but it shows how long these customs persisted. Their marriage famously went unconsummated for 7 years. 7 years, and everyone knew about it because of the bedding ceremony witnesses. On their wedding night, the teenage couple had been put to bed together with all the proper ceremony. But Louis, who was awkward and uncertain, possibly had a medical condition that made intercourse difficult. The couple did not consummate the marriage that night, or for many nights after. The witnesses, of course, could not testify to actual consummation. The ladies who inspected the sheets found nothing, and because this was the French royal family, because the whole point of the marriage was to produce an heir, this became a massive political problem. Ambassadors sent reports back to their countries about the unconsummated royal marriage. Court gossip was vicious. Marie Antoinette's mother, the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, sent increasingly frantic letters demanding to know why there was no pregnancy, no heir. The poor couple's intimate difficulties became a matter of international concern, all because the bedding ceremony witnesses had created a record, or rather a lack of record, of what had or had not happened. But let us return to our earlier period and talk about England, because English royal bedding ceremonies had their own particular character. Remember King Charles II, whom we mentioned at the beginning? He was notorious for his involvement in bedding ceremonies, and not always in ways that seem appropriate even by medieval standards. At the wedding of his niece Mary to William of Orange, Charles did not just draw the curtains. According to scandalized reports from contemporary observers, he made bawdy jokes throughout the ceremony, treated the whole thing like entertainment, and allegedly even stayed in the room longer than was strictly necessary, making suggestive comments. Why would a king behave this way? Partly because Charles was known for his libertine personality. He had numerous mistresses and illegitimate children, and was not exactly prudish about sexual matters, but also because, by his time, bedding ceremonies were beginning to be seen as old-fashioned, slightly ridiculous customs that people performed out of obligation rather than genuine belief in their necessity. Charles was almost mocking the ceremony even as he participated in it. He was caught between two worlds: the old medieval world where bedding ceremonies were sacred, serious rituals, and the emerging modern world where they were becoming embarrassing anachronisms. Yet despite his joking, the ceremony still happened. Why? Because diplomatic marriages still required proof. When Mary married William, it was not just a family union, it was England aligning itself with the Netherlands against France. The marriage needed to be unimpeachable, beyond question. So even though people like Charles might joke about it, even though the cultural attitude was shifting, the ceremony persisted because the political and legal needs remained. Now let us talk about something that might surprise you: the role of furniture in royal bedding ceremonies, because these were not just any beds, they were political statements in themselves. Royal beds during this period were among the most expensive pieces of furniture ever created. A proper royal bed, the kind used in important bedding ceremonies, could cost more than a large house. The bed used for important diplomatic marriages might be commissioned months in advance, designed specifically for the occasion. These beds had carved wooden frames, often gilded with real gold. The headboards might be 8 or 10 feet tall, carved with the coats of arms of both families being united. The canopies were architectural marvels, held up by carved posts, draped with fabrics that had been embroidered by the finest craftspeople in the kingdom. We are talking about hundreds or even thousands of hours of labour going into the creation of a single bed. And why? Because when ambassadors and nobles filed into that bedchamber to witness the bedding, they were being shown more than just a couple. They were being shown the wealth, the power, the prestige of the kingdom. There are records of royal beds being loaned between families for particularly important marriages. If a noble family could borrow the king's bed for their daughter's wedding, it elevated the entire ceremony. It signalled royal approval and added legitimacy. Similarly, some royal beds became famous, were used for multiple generations of marriages, became almost legendary objects. The bed itself became part of the witness testimony. They were married in the great bed that has been used for royal weddings since the time of King so-and-so. The continuity of the bed connected each new marriage to a long line of dynastic unions, and there were more practical considerations too. Remember the Earl of Oxford testing Arthur and Catherine's bed? That was not unique. Before important royal bedding ceremonies, someone, usually a high-ranking official, would physically inspect the bed. They would lie down on it, feel the mattress, make sure nothing sharp protruded, ensure the structure was sound. This was partly about safety and comfort, but it was also about ensuring there could be no excuses later. If a marriage was not consummated, the groom could not claim the bed was uncomfortable, or that something about the sleeping arrangements made consummation impossible. The pre-inspection removed any such defences. One more aspect of royal bedding ceremonies deserves our attention: the timing. These ceremonies did not happen immediately after the wedding feast. There was often a structured progression to the evening. First, the feast would continue for hours with entertainment, musicians, dancers, perhaps theatrical performances. This served multiple purposes. It gave the bride and groom time to gather their courage. It allowed the wine to flow freely, helping everyone relax a bit. But it also built anticipation, kept the witnesses, particularly the important diplomatic witnesses, present and engaged. Then, at a designated moment, the ceremony would begin. Attendants would approach the bride and groom separately, whispering that it was time. The couple would rise from the feast table, and the processions would form. But even then, There were more steps. The separate undressing ceremonies could take half an hour or more, because these were elaborate garments that could not be quickly removed. The processions through palace corridors, with their music and formality, added more time. By the time the couple actually reached the bed, hours might have passed since the wedding ceremony itself. Exhaustion was a real factor. Imagine being on display for that long, knowing what was coming, unable to escape or take a private moment. For young brides especially, and remember, many royal brides were 13, 14, 15 years old, this extended ordeal must have been terrifying. They were often married to much older men they barely knew, in foreign countries where they did not speak the language well, surrounded by strangers, and now facing the most intimate moment of their lives as a public performance. When historians talk about the trauma of arranged marriages, this is part of what they mean. Not just the marriage itself, but the brutal publicity of the bedding ceremony. Yet for all this discomfort, for all the invasion of privacy, we must remember, to the people of the time this made sense. Royal marriages were too important to be left to trust. Too much depended on them. Peace between nations, inheritance of vast territories, the legitimacy of heirs who might one day rule millions of people. The bedding ceremony, uncomfortable as it was, provided certainty in an uncertain world. It gave diplomats something concrete to report. It gave legal scholars evidence to cite. It gave subjects reassurance that their rulers' marriages were legitimate and that the line of succession was secure. And so across the palaces of Europe for centuries this ritual played out again and again, royal couples being dressed, blessed, paraded, witnessed, and finally mercifully left alone as bed curtains closed and the assembled crowd filed out, their witnessing duty complete. Each ceremony was unique in its details, but all shared that same fundamental purpose: to make private intimacy into public proof, to transform a wedding night into a political document written in silk and witnessed by the powerful. But of course, royalty represented only a tiny fraction of medieval Europe's population. What about everyone else? What about the clergy who preached about marriage but also had to navigate these ceremonies? What happened when the Church's spiritual authority met the earthly reality of bedding rituals? That intersection of sacred and profane, of religious blessing and sexual consummation, created some of the most fascinating and contradictory aspects of the entire bedding ceremony tradition. Let us turn now from the palaces to the churches and see how priests and bishops dealt with blessing beds and newlyweds. A priest stands at the foot of a marriage bed, a vial of holy water in one hand, a prayer book in the other. He makes the sign of the cross over the mattress, over the pillows, over the blankets. He murmurs Latin prayers asking God to bless this bed, to make it fruitful, to protect the couple from evil spirits and ensure they produce many children. Behind him wait the bride and groom, about to climb into that bed while he and dozens of others watch. And somehow, in the medieval mind, this was not contradictory. A man of God, sworn to celibacy, blessing a bed where sexual intercourse was about to happen. The sacred meeting the profane in the most intimate space imaginable. This was the Church's complicated dance with the bedding ceremony, simultaneously blessing it and trying to control it, sanctifying it while being deeply uncomfortable with it. The Catholic Church's relationship with marriage in medieval Europe was nothing if not complex. On one hand, the Church taught that marriage was a sacrament, one of the 7 holy rites through which God's grace flowed to humanity. Marriage was sacred, instituted by God Himself in the Garden of Eden. On the other hand, the Church also taught that celibacy was the higher calling, that virginity was more pleasing to God than marriage, that sexual desire, even within marriage, was tainted by original sin. So when it came to bedding ceremonies, the Church found itself in an awkward position, trying to bless and sanctify something it considered spiritually inferior to complete abstinence. Let us begin with the priest's blessing of the bed, because this was often the first official church involvement in the bedding ceremony. The practice varied somewhat by region and time period, but the basic structure remained fairly consistent across medieval Europe. After the wedding ceremony in the church, after the feast, when the time came for bedding, a priest, sometimes the same one who had performed the marriage, sometimes a different cleric, would be summoned to the bedchamber. He would arrive carrying items of religious significance, holy water that had been blessed by a bishop, sometimes a relic of a saint, occasionally holy oil used for anointing. The bed blessing ritual itself could be quite elaborate. The priest would walk around the bed, sprinkling holy water at each corner while reciting prayers. These prayers came from authorized church texts, carefully worded to ask for God's blessing on the marriage, without being too explicit about what was about to happen in that bed. A typical prayer might go something like this: "Bless, O Lord, this bed and all who rest in it. Let them live in your peace and grow in your love. Grant them children according to your will, and make them faithful to you and to each other all the days of their lives." Notice the careful language there. All who rest in it, not all who make love in it. Grant them children, with no mention of how those children would be conceived. The church wanted to sanctify the marriage bed, but it did not want to seem like it was endorsing sexual pleasure. The goal of marriage, according to the medieval church teaching, was procreation. Sex was acceptable, even blessed, but only as a means to that end, not as something to be enjoyed for its own sake. But the priest's role went beyond just sprinkling holy water and saying prayers. He also served as an official witness to the bedding. His presence added religious authority to the ceremony, making it not just a legal or social ritual but a sacred one. And in many cases, the priest would stay in the room or just outside the door until he was satisfied that the couple had genuinely gone to bed together. His testimony could be crucial if the marriage was ever challenged. A priest's word carried more weight in court than a layperson's, so having clerical witnesses to the bedding was especially valuable for families concerned about potential annulment attempts. And then there was the benediction posset, that cup of spiced wine we have mentioned before. This drink was not just any wine, it had to be specially prepared and then blessed by a priest, who would make the sign of the cross over it and pray that it would bring sweetness and joy to the marriage. The recipe for benediction posset varied, but most versions included wine or ale, honey, spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, and sometimes milk or eggs to make it richer. The couple would drink from the same cup, taking turns while witnesses watched. This shared drinking had symbolic weight. It represented the unity of the marriage, the two becoming one, but it also had a practical purpose. The alcohol helped nervous newlyweds relax. Now here is where things get interesting. The church authorities who wrote about marriage in theological texts, who developed the doctrine and the rules, were almost all celibate men, bishops, abbots, theologians who had never married and never would. They were trying to regulate and sanctify an experience they would never have. Can you imagine the cognitive dissonance? These men spent their days studying scripture and church fathers, living in monasteries or cathedral cloisters, pledged to lives of sexual abstinence. And then they had to write the prayers and rules for bedding ceremonies, had to decide what was appropriate for couples to do on their wedding nights, had to bless beds they would never lie in with partners they would never have. This created some fascinating tensions. There are medieval church documents where bishops argued vehemently about details of bedding ceremonies. Should the priest stay in the room or wait outside? Should he bless the couple before or after they undressed? Should there be prayers after consummation or only before? These learned men debated questions about sexual logistics with an earnestness that would be comical if it were not so revealing of their discomfort. One particularly interesting debate centered on timing. Some church authorities argued that the bedding ceremony should happen immediately after the church wedding, while the couple was still in a state of grace from receiving the sacrament. Others countered that this would mean blessing the bed during daylight hours, which seemed inappropriate. Everyone knew that marital relations should happen at night in darkness with minimal visibility. The compromise that eventually emerged in most places was that the wedding would happen during the day, the feast would last into the evening, and the bedding ceremony would take place after dark, but while church officials were still sober enough to perform their duties properly. And speaking of church officials staying sober, this was a real concern. Wedding feasts were notorious for heavy drinking, and priests were not exempt from partaking. There are records of complaints from church reformers about priests who showed up to bless marriage beds while clearly drunk, who forgot the proper prayers, who made inappropriate jokes. One 14th century bishop wrote a stern letter to his priests, reminding them that the bedding ceremony was a holy rite and should be treated with the dignity appropriate to a sacrament, not as an excuse for revelry. Apparently some priests had been joining in the bawdy songs and ribald jokes that accompanied bedding processions, behaviour the bishop found completely unacceptable. But beyond the official church involvement, there was also a layer of folk religion and popular belief that surrounded bedding ceremonies, often making church authorities very uncomfortable. People wanted more than just holy water and formal prayers. They wanted charms, talismans, protections against evil, and so a whole tradition developed of herbal sachets and botanical blessings that existed in a grey area between church-approved ritual and pagan superstition. Consider rosemary. This herb was almost universally present at medieval European weddings, and especially at bedding ceremonies. Sprigs of rosemary would be scattered on the bed, woven into the bride's hair, sometimes even sewn into the mattress. Why rosemary? The folk belief was that rosemary ensured fidelity in marriage. Its evergreen nature, staying green through winter, symbolized enduring love. Its strong scent was thought to ward off evil spirits who might curse the marriage bed. Church authorities were ambivalent about this. On one hand, rosemary was just a plant, seemingly harmless. On the other hand, attributing magical protective powers to an herb seemed dangerously close to witchcraft. The same ambivalence surrounded lavender, which was also extremely popular at bedding ceremonies. Lavender sachets would be tucked under pillows. Lavender water would be sprinkled on the sheets. The folk belief was that lavender promoted purity, protected virginity until the proper time, and then ensured successful consummation. Again, church authorities were uncertain. Was this just a pleasant-smelling herb, or were people engaging in magical thinking that contradicted Christian doctrine about God's sovereignty over fertility and marriage? In some Germanic regions, the mixture of Christian and pre-Christian practices became even more pronounced. There were traditions of placing greenery under the marriage bed, not just herbs, but actually branches of oak or ash or other trees considered sacred in pre-Christian Germanic religion. These branches were supposed to enhance fertility, to connect the couple to the life force of nature. Sometimes acorns would be scattered under the bed or seeds of various kinds. The symbolism was obvious. Just as seeds grow into plants, so should this union produce children. Church reformers hated this. They saw it as paganism dressed up in wedding clothes, a continuation of old Germanic nature worship that Christianity was supposed to have replaced. But they could not stop it because the practice was too widespread, too popular, too deeply embedded in local custom. So instead they tried to co-opt it. Priests would bless the greenery, would say prayers over the seeds, would try to redirect the symbolism toward Christian concepts of God as the giver of life rather than nature itself as a life force. It was an uneasy compromise between old and new belief systems. And then there were the more explicitly superstitious practices that some couples engaged in, much to the horror of church authorities. There were beliefs about the importance of which side of the bed you got into first, about what you should say or not say on your wedding night, about specific prayers that would ensure male children rather than female. Some of these beliefs were clearly pagan in origin. Others were garbled Christianity, folk misunderstandings of church teaching mixed with local superstition. One practice that particularly bothered church reformers was the tradition of divination by stocking, which we have mentioned before, but which deserves deeper examination. Remember, the groomsmen and bridesmaids would sit on the bed and throw the couple's stockings over their shoulders, trying to hit the bride or groom. If you hit your target, you would supposedly be the next to marry. Church authorities did not like this at all. They considered it fortune-telling, which was explicitly forbidden by Christian doctrine. Trying to predict the future through stockings thrown at a bed. That was divination. It was superstition. It was wrong. But again, they could not stop it. The stocking game was too much fun, too traditional, too expected at weddings. So priests just had to stand there having blessed the bed and watch as the assembled guests engaged in what the church officially considered sinful behavior. The cognitive dissonance must have been remarkable. You have just sanctified this bed in God's name. You have prayed for the couple's holy union, and now people are playing fortune-telling games 3 feet from where you're standing. There is a broader point here about medieval Christianity that the bedding ceremony illuminates beautifully. We often think of the medieval church as all-powerful, controlling every aspect of life. And certainly the church tried to control everything, had opinions about everything, wanted to regulate everything. But on the ground, in actual practice, medieval Christianity was a messy mixture of official doctrine and popular belief, of church teaching and folk custom, of what priests said you should do and what people actually did. The bedding ceremony sat right at that intersection. The church insisted marriage was a sacrament blessed by God. But the church also taught that celibacy was holier than marriage, that sexual desire was tainted by sin. So how do you sanctify a bed that exists specifically for sexual activity? How do you bless an act, consummation, that you simultaneously teach is spiritually inferior to abstinence? The answer was a lot of carefully worded prayers, a lot of symbolic gestures like holy water, and a lot of looking the other way when people mixed in folk practices the church did not officially approve. And let us not forget another complicating factor. Many of the priests blessing these beds were not, themselves, as celibate as they were supposed to be. This is an uncomfortable historical fact, but it is a fact nonetheless. Throughout the medieval period, especially in rural areas, many priests had concubines, women they lived with in relationships that were marriages in all but name. Some priests had children whom everyone in the village knew were theirs. The church officially forbade clerical marriage and demanded celibacy, but enforcement was sporadic at best. So imagine being a villager watching your local priest, who everyone knows has a woman living with him, who everyone suspects has fathered children, standing at the foot of a marriage bed, blessing it in the name of holy matrimony. The hypocrisy must have been glaring, and yet people accepted it. Why? Partly because the priest's personal behaviour did not invalidate his official functions. In Catholic theology, the efficacy of sacraments did not depend on the worthiness of the priest performing them. A blessing from a sinful priest was still a valid blessing. But also people accepted it because this was just how the world was. Ideals were ideals, reality was reality, and you navigated between them as best you could. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century changed some of these dynamics significantly. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther rejected celibacy requirements for clergy. Luther himself famously married a former nun, Katharina von Bora. Protestant ministers could marry, could have families, could experience the same joys and challenges as their congregations. This changed the tone of bedding ceremonies in Protestant regions. A married minister blessing a bed was not engaging in the same kind of cognitive dissonance as the celibate Catholic priest. He had been there, so to speak. He understood what he was blessing from personal experience. But the bedding ceremony itself remained uncomfortable for Protestants too, just for different reasons. Protestant theology emphasized Scripture alone as the source of religious authority, and there was no biblical mandate for bedding ceremonies. They were tradition, custom, but not commanded by God. Many Protestant reformers wanted to simplify and purify religious practice, to strip away medieval elaborations and return to biblical simplicity. Bedding ceremonies, with all their pageantry and ritual, looked to reformers like exactly the kind of human tradition that should be discarded. Yet even Protestant communities continued bedding ceremonies, because the social and legal needs remained. You still needed witnesses. You still needed to prove consummation. So Protestant bedding ceremonies became less overtly religious. Fewer prayers, less holy water, less clerical involvement, but they did not disappear. They just became more civic than sacred, more about community witnessing than divine blessing. There is one more aspect of the Church's involvement with bedding ceremonies that deserves attention: the regulation of when consummation could happen. The medieval Church had elaborate rules about forbidden times for marital relations. You were not supposed to have sex during Lent, during Advent, on Sundays, on feast days, during menstruation, during pregnancy, while nursing. When you added up all the forbidden times, there were only about 180 days per year when sex was technically allowed, even within marriage. Now, did people follow these rules? Almost certainly not, at least not completely. But the rules existed, and they created anxiety. If your wedding happened during a forbidden time, or if the wedding feast extended into a forbidden day, what were you supposed to do? Some couples would have the wedding, but then wait for the bedding ceremony until a permissible time. Others went ahead with the bedding but felt guilty about it. Still others just ignored the rules entirely and hoped God would forgive them. This added yet another layer of complexity to the priest's role in bedding ceremonies. He was supposed to be a guardian of these temporal regulations, making sure couples did not consummate their marriages during forbidden times. But he was also supposed to witness the bedding to ensure the marriage was completed. These duties could conflict. If a wedding happened on a Friday in Lent, for example, the priest was in an impossible position. He was supposed to bless the bed, but also supposed to tell the couple not to actually use it for several weeks. Unsurprisingly, most priests just went ahead with the blessing and let the couple figure out the timing themselves. All of this reveals something profound about the medieval Church's relationship with human sexuality. The Church wanted to control it, regulate it, sanctify it, but the Church also did not quite trust it, did not fully approve of it, even within the holy sacrament of marriage. Sexual desire was always suspect, always potentially sinful, always needing to be channeled and constrained. The bedding ceremony, with the priest's blessing and the Church's involvement, was an attempt to manage and contain something the Church found both necessary and disturbing. And the couples themselves? What did they think about having a priest bless their marriage bed, about mixing religious ritual with sexual intimacy? We do not have many records of their private thoughts. Most medieval people were not literate, did not leave diaries or letters discussing their feelings. But we can infer something from the fact that they kept requesting these blessings, kept inviting priests to their bedchambers, kept following rituals that mixed the sacred and the profane. Perhaps it brought them comfort, perhaps it eased their anxieties about the unknown. Perhaps it made the transition from virgin to married person feel less frightening, knowing that God's blessing rested on what was about to happen. Or perhaps they just did it because everyone did it, because it was expected, because this was how marriages worked. Not every medieval person was deeply religious. Not everyone spent time pondering theological implications. For many, the priest's blessing was just another part of the wedding, like the vows or the feast or the procession. You did it because that is what you did, and you did not think too deeply about the contradictions or the complexities. But those contradictions and complexities were real, and they shaped the experience of medieval marriage in profound ways. The church's uncomfortable dance with the bedding ceremony, blessing beds while preaching celibacy, sanctifying sex while teaching it was spiritually inferior, involving priests in the intimate moments while demanding priestly chastity. All of this created a culture where sexuality was simultaneously celebrated and feared, accepted and controlled, normal and dangerous. And now, having explored the legal requirements, the royal spectacles, and the religious dimensions of bedding ceremonies, we are ready to see what the actual ceremony looked like step by step. From the moment the feast ended to the moment the curtains finally closed around that blessed, witnessed, scrutinized bed. Let us walk through a medieval bedding ceremony in detail, watching each ritual, each gesture, each uncomfortable moment, and understanding what it all meant to the people who lived it. Close your eyes for a moment and try to transport yourself back in time. It is a warm summer evening in 1450, somewhere in the English countryside. You're 18 years old and you got married this morning in the village church. The ceremony was beautiful. The feast has been going on for hours. Roasted meats, fresh bread, honey cakes, barrels of ale that seem bottomless. Musicians have been playing, people have been dancing. Your new spouse sits beside you at the head table, and you've barely had time to speak to each other all day because there have been so many toasts, so many well-wishers, so much commotion. Your feet hurt from dancing, your head buzzes from the ale, and then, as the sun finally sets and torches are lit around the hall, you notice something. People are exchanging glances, smiling knowingly, and your stomach drops because you realize it is time for the part of the wedding nobody really talks about in polite company, but everyone knows is coming. The bedding ceremony is about to begin. What happens next follows a choreography that has been refined over centuries, a series of steps so ingrained in medieval culture that almost everyone knows their role without being told. And yet each step is designed to be slightly mortifying, slightly uncomfortable, a strange mixture of celebration and ordeal. Let us walk through it together, moment by moment, and feel what it must have been like to experience this most peculiar of medieval customs. The first signal comes subtly. Your mother, or perhaps an aunt or older sister, approaches you quietly amid the noise of the feast. She leans close and whispers something you have been both anticipating and dreading. It is time to prepare. Your spouse receives a similar message from his father or uncle or older brother. And just like that, the trajectory of the evening changes. What was a party becomes a procession towards something far more serious. But you do not go immediately to the bedroom. Oh no. First comes the separation and the undressing, and this happens in completely different parts of the house or manor or castle. You, the bride, are led away by a group of women, your female relatives, your friends, perhaps some of the more important women from the village if your family has status. They take you to a private chamber, and there they begin to undress you. Every single item of your wedding attire must be removed. The elaborate gown that took months to make or borrow, the special underthings, the flowers woven into your hair, the jewellery, everything. Now you might think this sounds simple, but remember, medieval clothing is not like modern clothing. A wedding gown of any quality has dozens of tiny buttons, laces that crisscross in complex patterns, multiple layers. Getting into it this morning required help from several people and took nearly an hour. Getting out of it now takes almost as long. And the whole time these women are talking. Some are offering advice, the older married women dispensing wisdom about what to expect, how to behave, what will please your new husband. Some are making jokes, trying to ease your nervousness with bawdy humour that makes you blush. Some are reminiscing about their own wedding nights, sharing stories that are meant to be reassuring, but somehow make you even more anxious. Just lie still and think of something pleasant, one aunt advises. It will be over soon enough. Do not be frightened if there is pain, another adds, with what she probably thinks is helpful honesty. That is normal for the first time. Make sure you show proper modesty, says a third, contradicting the earlier advice to relax. A good wife is demure and obedient. Can you imagine trying to process all these conflicting messages while strangers undress you, and you know that in a few minutes you will be paraded through corridors toward a bed where your new husband and several dozen other people are waiting? The psychological pressure must have been enormous. Meanwhile, in another chamber, your groom is going through his own version of this ritual. The men around him are louder, more boisterous. There is a lot of backslapping, a lot of jokes about his upcoming performance, a lot of advice that is probably more crude than helpful. They strip him down just as thoroughly as you are being stripped, because both bride and groom need to be in their nightclothes for the ceremony. For him, this means a simple nightshirt, usually white linen, loose and falling to about mid-thigh. Sometimes a robe or gown is placed over it for the procession. For you, the bride, the nightgown is more elaborate. It's been specially made or saved for this occasion, often embroidered with symbols of fertility, flowers, vines, sometimes small birds. It is designed to be both modest and romantic, covering you from neck to ankle, but made of fabric fine enough to be somewhat revealing. A veil is placed over your hair, sometimes covering your face. In some traditions, you're blindfolded until you reach the ben, though this was not universal. The symbolism of the veil is complex. It represents modesty and virginity, but also the mystery and revelation of the wedding night. Once both of you are properly dressed for bed, the processions form. This is where the ceremony becomes truly public, truly theatrical. Your group of women assembles in a specific order. The most respected woman, often the most recently married woman in your family or sometimes the oldest matriarch, leads. Behind her, you walk supported on either side by female attendants. Behind you come the other women, and some of them are carrying things, candles, cups of wine, baskets of flowers or herbs, blankets and pillows for the bed. It is a parade, essentially, moving through the halls of wherever you're staying. And here is the part that medieval accounts emphasize again and again. This procession is accompanied by music and singing, but not gentle romantic music. No, the songs are bawdy, explicit, often shockingly crude. They are old folk songs, passed down through generations, and they say things in very direct language about what is about to happen in that marriage bed. Some of the lyrics would make a modern person blush. They talk about body parts and activities with the frankness that is startling even today. And this is happening while you, a probably virginal young person, are being marched toward your wedding bed. The male procession, meanwhile, is even rowdier. Your groom is surrounded by his male friends and relatives, and they're singing the same kinds of songs, maybe louder, maybe with additional verses they're making up on the spot. Some accounts from 16th century Germany describe these processions as being accompanied by pipes, drums, and obscene noises, musicians playing instruments while men made deliberate vulgar sounds, all of it designed to be funny, to ease tension through humour, but also to be just a bit humiliating. The two processions converge at the bedroom door. And here, if the family is following the more elaborate traditions, something interesting happens. The leading woman from your procession and the leading man from the groom's procession pause. They ceremonially open the door together, symbolizing the joining of two families, the cooperation that will be needed to make this marriage work. Everyone else crowds in behind, filling the bedroom until it's packed with people, wall to wall, all talking, laughing, jostling for position. The bed itself is the centerpiece of all this activity. Remember, it has already been blessed by a priest. It has been prepared with fresh linens, special blankets, possibly those herbal sachets we discussed. In wealthier households, the bed might have been decorated specifically for this night. Flowers strewn across the pillows, special embroidered bed curtains hung, even the floorboards around it swept and perhaps scattered with rose petals or lavender. The bed is not just furniture at this moment. It is a stage, an altar, the focus of everyone's attention. You and your new spouse are led to the bed by your respective attendants. There is a specific protocol for this in many regions. The bride enters the bed from the left side, the groom from the right. Why? The symbolism goes back to biblical references about wives standing at their husband's right hand, though the practical effect is just to create a choreographed moment. You climb into the bed, or more accurately, you are helped into the bed, because the nightgown you're wearing is long and you are nervous and there are so many people watching. Your groom climbs in from the other side, equally awkward, equally watched. And now you're both sitting in bed, probably not even touching yet, while 20 or 30 or 40 people stand around staring at you. Your heart is pounding, you can feel every eye. The room smells of candle wax and herbs and too many people in too small a space. Someone is still singing in the background. Nervous laughter ripples through the crowd. Then comes the posset. Remember that blessed wine drink. A cup is brought forward, filled with the warm, spiced wine that is meant to fortify you both. Someone hands it to your groom first. He drinks, then passes it to you. The symbolism of sharing the cup is important. You are sharing your lives now, everything together. One cup, one bed, one future. The wine is sweet but strong, and you are grateful for it because your mouth is dry and your hands are shaking, and maybe, just maybe, the alcohol will help you feel less terrified. And then, the stocking game. This is the moment that medieval accounts describe with the most detail, probably because it was the most entertaining part for the spectators. Two groomsmen position themselves on one side of the bed, your side, sitting with their backs to you. Two bridesmaids position themselves on the other side, your groom's side, also sitting with backs turned. They each hold a stocking, one of yours and one of his, removed earlier during the undressing. The game is simple but chaotic. Each person takes a turn throwing the stocking backwards over their shoulder, trying to hit the person on the bed. If a groomsman hits you, the bride, he will supposedly be the next to marry. If a bridesmaid hits the groom, she will be the next bride. People take this semi-seriously, which means they throw hard, they aim as best they can despite having their backs turned, and sometimes the stockings hit you in the face, which everyone finds hilarious except possibly you. This goes on for several rounds. Stockings flying through the air, people shouting encouragement or mockery, laughter filling the room, and you are sitting there in your nightgown, being pelted with hosiery, trying to maintain some sense of dignity, wondering if this is really happening or if you have somehow stumbled into a fever dream. Eventually, mercifully, the stocking game ends. The attendants gather up the scattered stockings, the crowd settles down slightly, and now comes the moment that everything has been building toward. The bed curtains, those thick fabric panels that surround medieval beds for warmth and privacy, are slowly drawn closed. As they close, they create a cocoon around you and your new spouse, shutting out the faces, the candles, the noise. For the first time all day you are hidden from view, but you are not alone, not really, because on the other side of those curtains the crowd is still there. In some traditions they are supposed to leave immediately at this point, filing out quietly to let you have privacy. But in practice many stay. They move the party outside the bedroom door, where they continue singing, drinking, making noise. The reason given is innocent enough. The noise covers any sounds from inside the bedroom, preserving some modesty for the couple. But the effect is that you know, as you lie there beside someone you barely know, that dozens of people are waiting just outside, listening, speculating, waiting to see what happens. In 16th century Germany, according to the contemporary accounts, the guests specifically made the party so loud that the newlyweds could not be heard. They banged on pots, played instruments badly on purpose, sang at the top of their lungs. It was meant as a kindness, a way to give the couple some acoustic privacy, even if they could not have spatial privacy. But imagine trying to have an intimate moment while a cacophony rages just outside the door. The pressure to perform, to consummate the marriage quickly so the waiting crowd could finally disperse, must have been intense. And here we need to pause and acknowledge something. For many medieval newlyweds, this night was their first experience of sexual intimacy. They had not dated in any modern sense. They might have been formally betrothed for months or years, but courtship was heavily chaperoned. They certainly had not lived together, had not had any kind of physical relationship. Everything they knew about sex came from vague advice from watching farm animals, from whispered conversations and crude jokes. And now they were expected to figure it out, right now, on command essentially, with an audience waiting for confirmation. Some couples, overwhelmed by all of this, simply lay in that bed and talked, or cried, or fell asleep from exhaustion. Remember, they had been up since dawn for the wedding ceremony, had eaten and drunk heavily all day, were emotionally and physically drained. The assumption that consummation would happen immediately was not always accurate, but the couple could not really explain that to the waiting crowd without embarrassment. So often they would just stay in the bed for a decent interval, maybe an hour, maybe longer, and then emerge or signal somehow that the ceremony was complete. Other couples did attempt a consummation despite the horrible circumstances, and for them, especially for young brides who had been filled with terrifying stories about pain and blood, the experience could be traumatic. The combination of physical discomfort, psychological pressure, awareness of the crowd outside, and lack of any real privacy create conditions about as far from ideal as you could imagine. That many medieval marriages survived this beginning and went on to be functional. Even happy partnerships is actually remarkable when you think about what they had to overcome. In Scandinavian traditions, there was one additional element that made this even more complicated. After the couple had been in bed for a while, the prescribed time varied, but often it was about half an hour. The most distinguished guest at the wedding was supposed to enter the bedroom, approach the bed, and offer the couple food. This guest would carry a tray with special dishes, usually sweet cakes or pastries and more wine. The couple was expected to sit up, open the bed curtains slightly, and eat a small amount of this food while the distinguished guest watched. Then the guest would quickly eat something from the tray as well, symbolizing the joining of families through shared food, and finally leave, drawing the curtains closed again for the final time. Can you imagine? You've just been through this entire ordeal. You're finally alone with your new spouse. You're trying to figure out this whole marriage thing, and then someone knocks on the door and comes in with snacks. The psychological whiplash of that moment, from intimacy back to public performance and then back to intimacy again, must have been disorienting. But eventually, finally, the ceremony truly ended. The guests dispersed. The music stopped. The house or castle or manor grew quiet. And the bride and groom were genuinely left alone at last, sometimes for the first time in their entire acquaintance. What happened in those quiet hours after the ceremony ended? We can only imagine. Some couples probably talked, getting to know each other a bit, sharing their thoughts about the overwhelming day. Some probably fell immediately into exhausted sleep. Some attempted consummation if they had not already. And some just lay there in the darkness, processing everything, wondering what their new life together would be like. The morning would bring its own rituals, of course. The inspection of sheets, the expectation that the couple would appear at breakfast and face more jokes and comments, the beginning of their life as a married unit rather than two individuals. But those morning rituals, invasive as they could be, were nothing compared to the intensity of the bedding ceremony itself. Because the bedding ceremony was designed to be intense. It was meant to create witnesses, yes, but it was also meant to mark a transition. It was a liminal moment, a threshold crossing from one state of being to another. The discomfort was almost part of the point. It made the moment memorable, ensured that everyone present would remember exactly what they had witnessed if they ever needed to testify about it. The embarrassment and awkwardness were features, not bugs, of the system. And yet, despite all this, despite the invasiveness and the discomfort and the sheer mortifying spectacle of it all, most medieval couples went through with it. They endured it because it was expected, because it was traditional, because it was how marriage worked. Some probably hated every second. Others might have found comfort in the community involvement, in knowing that everyone they loved was celebrating their union even if the celebration took bizarre forms. And at least a few, the ones with particularly good senses of humour or particularly outgoing personalities, might have even enjoyed parts of it, might have laughed along with the jokes, might have thrown themselves into the performance aspect of it. But whether they loved it or hated it, they went through it. And in doing so, they participated in a ritual that bound them not just to each other, but to their community, their family, their social world. The bedding ceremony was uncomfortable, but it was also communal. It was invasive, but it was also inclusive. It was mortifying, but it was also memorable. And for all its strangeness, it served purposes that made sense to the people of that time. Legal validation, social integration, communal celebration of new beginnings. Now, having walked through each awkward, uncomfortable step of a typical bedding ceremony, we are ready to confront perhaps the most disturbing question of all. What happened when the witnesses did not just watch the procession and the bed preparation, but actually stayed to witness the consummation itself? When privacy disappeared completely, and the most intimate moments became truly, horrifyingly public. Those rare but documented cases push the boundaries of what we can comprehend, and yet they happened. Let us explore these extreme situations and understand why, in some circumstances, medieval people believed even this ultimate invasion of privacy was necessary. There are some historical truths that make us deeply uncomfortable, that challenge our ability to understand how people in the past thought and lived. What I am about to describe is one of those truths. In most of the bedding ceremonies we have discussed, witnesses saw the couple enter the bed, watched the rituals, and then departed, leaving the newlyweds alone for the actual consummation. But in some cases, rare, but documented and verified through multiple historical sources, the witnesses did not leave. They stayed. They remained in the room, behind the bed curtains or standing nearby, and they listened. Sometimes they even watched. And the question we need to ask ourselves is not just how could this happen, but why did people think this was necessary? Because understanding that why is the only path to truly comprehending medieval marriage and the desperate need for certainty in a world without our modern systems of proof. Let us begin with the most extreme case I have found in historical records, one that still has the power to shock us nearly 500 years later. The year is 1540. The place is England. King Henry VIII, yes, that Henry VIII, the one who famously had 6 wives, has just married his 4th wife, Anne of Cleves. This is a political marriage, arranged to create an alliance between England and the German Protestant states. Henry has never met Annie in person before the wedding. He has only seen a flattering portrait painted by Hans Holbein. When Anne finally arrives in England and Henry meets her, he is disappointed. He finds her unattractive, calls her a Flanders mare behind her back, but the political situation is delicate and he goes through with the wedding anyway. The wedding night is a disaster. Henry, who is 48 years old at this point, overweight, suffering from a painful ulcerated leg, and clearly not attracted to his new wife, either cannot or will not consummate the marriage. And this becomes a massive problem because without consummation, the marriage can be annulled. Within months, Henry is already looking for a way out, already infatuated with a young lady in waiting named Catherine Howard, who will become his fifth wife. But to annul the marriage to Anne, he needs proof that it was never consummated. And here is where it gets truly invasive. During the annulment proceedings, several of Anne's ladies in waiting were questioned under oath about the wedding night and the nights that followed. These women had slept in the same chamber as Anne, had been present in the room or in adjoining spaces, had seen and heard, or notably had not seen or heard, what happened between the king and his new queen. Their testimony was extraordinarily explicit. They described how Anne seemed confused about what should happen, how Henry would come to bed and lie beside her, but nothing more. How the Queen remained in what they delicately called the same state as when she arrived in England, meaning still a virgin. One lady in waiting testified that Anne had asked her whether she might be pregnant, saying, "How can I be with child? When he comes to bed, he kisses me and taketh me by the hand and biddeth me good night, and in the morning kisses me and biddeth me farewell. Is this not enough?" The lady had to explain to the naive Anne that no, that was decidedly not enough. These intimate details discussed in court, recorded by clerks, became part of the historical record because the ladies in waiting had been there, had witnessed or failed to witness consummation. Now, these ladies were not in the bed itself, were not directly watching the king and queen, but they were close enough to know what was or was not happening, and their presence, their ability to testify, was considered completely normal and necessary for a royal marriage of this importance. The fact that Anne's most intimate moments, or lack thereof, could be scrutinized by her servants and then discussed in public legal proceedings might seem shocking to us, but it was standard practice for royalty and high nobility. This brings us to an important distinction we need to understand about witness consummation. There were degrees of witnessing, and what was considered acceptable varied based on several factors: the importance of the marriage, the degree of doubt about the groom's ability or willingness, the specific regional customs, and whether this was a first marriage or a remarriage. The mildest form of witnessed consummation was what we might call acoustic witnessing. The witnesses would be in an adjacent room or outside the bedroom door, close enough to hear sounds that would indicate intimate activity was occurring. They were not watching, but they were listening, and they could later testify that they had heard evidence of consummation. This was common for noble marriages, where there was some concern about proper completion, but not serious enough doubt to warrant more direct observation. What kind of sounds were they listening for? Historical records are, understandably, somewhat delicate about this, but we can infer from legal documents and court testimonies. Movement of the bed frame, which in medieval times was often made of wood that creaked. Vocal sounds from either party, changes in breathing patterns. The witnesses were not eavesdropping out of prurient interest, or at least that was not the official reason. They were there to be able to swear, if necessary, that marital relations had taken place. A step more invasive was what we might call curtain witnessing. The bed curtains would be drawn around the couple as usual, providing visual privacy, but designated witnesses, usually trusted older relatives or officials, would remain in the room itself. They would position themselves away from the bed, sometimes facing the wall to avoid any possibility of actually seeing anything, but they would be present in the room. Their testimony could be more specific than acoustic witnessing because they were in the actual space, could attest not just to sounds but to the duration of time the couple spent in bed, to the state of the linens afterward, to any evidence of completion. This form of witnessing was more common in cases where significant property or political alliances hung on the marriage. If a bride brought an enormous dowry, if a groom was uniting two warring families, if the marriage was meant to seal a peace treaty, these situations sometimes required witnesses who could provide detailed, unassailable testimony. The couple was told in advance that witnesses would remain in the room. There was no surprise, no hidden observation. It was agreed upon as part of the marriage contract, another clause in the endless negotiations that surrounded medieval noble marriages. But then there was the most extreme form, and this is the one that truly challenges our modern sensibilities: direct witnessing. In very rare cases, when there was substantial doubt about a groom's capability, perhaps he was very elderly, perhaps he had a known medical condition, perhaps there had been rumours about impotence, witnesses would observe the consummation directly, not hidden, not listening from another room, but present and watching to verify that the marriage was being physically completed. This happened most often in royal marriages, where the production of legitimate heirs was of paramount importance to the stability of a kingdom. There are documented cases from France, from various German states, from the Spanish kingdoms, where official witnesses remained in the room with clear visual access to the bed during consummation. These witnesses were usually high-ranking court officials, sometimes bishops or other church leaders, people whose testimony would be considered absolutely reliable and beyond question. One of the most detailed accounts comes from France in the 14th century. When Princess Blanche of Navarre married King Philip of France in 1350, there were concerns about the king's age, he was in his mid-50s, and his ability to produce heirs. The marriage was politically crucial, so the bedding ceremony included official witnesses who could verify consummation. Contemporary chronicles describe the witnesses as standing at the foot of the bed to observe what was necessary for the kingdom. The language is formal, dry, bureaucratic, but the meaning is clear. These men watched to ensure the king successfully consummated his marriage. What must that have been like for young Blanche, marrying a man old enough to be her grandfather, knowing that their intimate act would be observed by strangers to ensure the king could perform his duty? What must it have been like for Philip, having to prove his capability under such circumstances? The psychological pressure on both parties must have been immense. And yet this was considered acceptable, even necessary, because the alternative, a marriage that might be questioned, heirs whose legitimacy might be disputed, succession crises that could plunge the kingdom into civil war, was considered far worse. There is another dimension to this witness consummation that we need to address, as uncomfortable as it is. In some cases, the witnesses were there not just to verify that consummation happened, but to verify that it was the couple themselves who consummated the marriage, not stand-ins or substitutes. There were apparently concerns in some arranged marriages where the groom was repugnant to the bride or vice versa, that one party might arrange for a substitute to complete the act. A handsome servant might take the groom's place in a darkened room. An attractive lady-in-waiting might substitute for an unwilling bride. This sounds like something from a Shakespeare comedy, and indeed, bed tricks and substitutions were common plot devices in medieval and Renaissance literature. But the reason these stories resonated with audiences is that they reflected real fears and occasionally real attempts at deception. Having witnesses who could verify the identity of both parties, who could testify, "Yes, I saw the king himself," or "Yes, I can confirm it was the princess," protected against this form of fraud. The legal implications of witnessed consummation were enormous. These witnesses could be called upon years or even decades later to testify about what they had observed. Their memories of that one night could determine whether children were legitimate heirs, whether a widow had the right to claim her dower, whether a marriage could be annulled. The witnesses understood the gravity of their role. They were not party guests having fun. They were fulfilling a legal function that might have consequences long after the wedding night itself. And this brings us to a question that might have occurred to you. Were these witnesses sworn to secrecy? Did they talk about what they'd seen? The answer is complicated. Officially, witnesses were supposed to be discreet. The intimate details of a marriage were not meant for public gossip, but in practice, information leaked. Court gossip was vicious and detailed. We know about many of these witnessed consummations specifically because people talked, because details ended up in letters, in chronicles, in court records when marriages were later contested. There was a distinction, though, between official testimony and gossip. A witness might be required to give explicit testimony in a legal proceeding, describing what they saw, what they heard, how long the couple was together, what state the bed was in afterward, but the same person would be expected to be much more circumspect in casual conversation. Violating this discretion could result in social ostracism or even legal penalties in some cases. The information was too sensitive, too potentially damaging to be treated casually. Now, we need to talk about something else that made witnessed consummation particularly traumatic: the morning inspection. In many cases where consummation was directly or closely witnessed, the morning after the wedding night brought another invasion of privacy. Female attendants, usually older married women, sometimes midwives, would enter the bedroom and inspect the bed linens, specifically looking for blood. The medieval belief, which we now know to be medically inaccurate, was that virginal brides would always bleed during first intercourse due to the tearing of the hymen. Therefore, blood on the sheets was considered proof of both the bride's virginity and the marriage's consummation. No blood might mean the bride had not been a virgin, or that the marriage had not been consummated, or potentially that there was something wrong with the bride physically. The absence of blood could be scandalous, could lead to questions and accusations, could even result in the marriage being contested. In some cultures, these blood-stained sheets were not just inspected privately, they were displayed publicly. Hung from a window of the bedroom or brought out and shown to assembled family members and guests, as proof that everything had happened as it should. There are records of this practice in various parts of medieval Europe, and it persisted in some regions well into the modern era. The humiliation for brides who did not bleed, for whatever reason, must have been devastating. What makes this particularly cruel is that we now know many women do not bleed during first intercourse. The hymen is not a barrier that must be torn. It is a thin membrane that can stretch, that may have already been stretched or torn through normal physical activity, that varies greatly in thickness from person to person. But medieval people did not know this. They believed blood was absolute proof and lack of blood was absolute evidence of either unchastity or non-consummation. Brides knew about this expectation. They grew up hearing about it, being warned about it, understanding that the morning inspection was coming. The anxiety this caused must have been terrible. Some brides, according to whispered accounts that occasionally surface in historical records, would prick their fingers or use other means to produce blood if they did not bleed naturally, because the social consequences of not bleeding were too severe to risk. We will never know how common this deception was, but the fact that people even considered it necessary speaks volumes about the pressure these women were under. And there is one more aspect of witness consummation we need to address. What happened when consummation failed? When, despite the witnesses, despite the pressure, despite everything, the couple could not or did not complete the act? This happened more often than you might think. Young brides were terrified. Grooms were nervous. The presence of witnesses, even acoustic witnesses outside the door, created performance anxiety. Medical conditions, trauma, fear, any number of factors could prevent successful consummation. In these situations, the witnesses became a problem rather than a solution. They could not lie. They were under oath, or at least under strong social obligation to tell the truth. If they had to testify that no, they did not hear sounds of consummation, no, the couple did not seem to be intimate, then the marriage was in jeopardy. The couple might be given another chance, another night, with the understanding that witnesses would be present again. But if consummation continued to fail, the marriage could be annulled, or the blame could fall heavily on one party, usually the groom, accused of impotence, which was socially devastating, or the bride accused of being unwilling or physically unable, which was equally shameful. There are heartbreaking cases in historical records of marriages that failed because of this pressure, this observation, this complete lack of privacy. Young couples who might have eventually figured things out in their own time, in their own way, instead fell apart under the scrutiny. The very system designed to ensure marriages were completed sometimes ensured they fell apart. So why, despite all this trauma, despite the obvious psychological harm, did witnessed consummation persist? Because the alternative from a medieval perspective was worse. A marriage that could be questioned was a marriage that could destabilize families, properties, kingdoms. Witnessed consummation was horrible, but it was predictable. It created certainty. And in a world of tremendous uncertainty, where infant mortality was high, where wars and plagues could destroy dynasties, where political alliances were fragile, certainty was precious, even if the price of that certainty was the couple's dignity and privacy. The witnesses who stayed, who saw and heard the most intimate moments of others' lives, carried that knowledge with them. They became living records of marriages, walking archives of legitimacy. Their memories and their willingness to testify made them powerful figures, sometimes uncomfortably powerful. They could destroy reputations with a few words. They could validate or invalidate claims to inheritance. They held information that could change the course of history, and yet most of these witnesses were not cruel people. They were doing what their society asked of them, fulfilling a role they saw as necessary and important. They probably did not enjoy the awkwardness any more than the couples did. But they understood, or believed they understood, that marriage was too important to leave to trust, that the stakes were too high to allow any doubt or uncertainty. So they stayed. They watched. They remembered. And centuries later, their testimonies still exist in archives, reminding us of a time when privacy was a luxury that important marriages simply could not afford. Now, having explored the most extreme, most invasive forms of bedding ceremonies, we are ready to step back and look at how this custom varied across different social classes. Because everything we have discussed so far has focused mainly on nobility and royalty, the people whose marriages were documented, whose ceremonies were recorded. But what about everyone else? What about the merchants and craftspeople and farmers who made up the vast majority of medieval Europe's population? How did they handle bedding ceremonies when they did not have palaces, or armies of servants, or political alliances at stake? The answer reveals fascinating differences in how the same custom could be adapted to very different circumstances and resources. Walk through any medieval village on a wedding day, and you would see something remarkable. The same custom, the bedding ceremony, being celebrated in ways so different they almost seem like entirely separate traditions. In the manor house on the hill, a noble bride might be preparing for an elaborate ceremony with dozens of witnesses, blessed beds, and imported wine. Meanwhile, down in the village, a farmer's daughter might be facing her own bedding ceremony with just a handful of neighbours, a borrowed blanket, and a cup of local ale. Same custom, same fundamental purpose, but the experience separated by a chasm as wide as the social classes themselves. This divide reveals something fascinating about medieval society, how even the most intimate customs were shaped by wealth, status, and access to resources. Let us explore how bedding ceremonies looked across the social spectrum, from the poorest peasants to the wealthiest merchants, and discover what these differences tell us about life in medieval Europe. At the very bottom of the social ladder were the peasants, the serfs and tenant farmers, who worked the land and made up perhaps 70 to 80% of medieval Europe's population. Their weddings, and therefore their bedding ceremonies, were stripped down to the absolute essentials by necessity. These people lived on the edge of survival. A bad harvest could mean starvation. A sickness could devastate a family. They did not have resources for elaborate ceremonies, expensive beds, or lengthy celebrations, but they still needed to get married, still needed their marriages to be recognized and valid, still needed witnesses to prove consummation had occurred. So what did a peasant bedding ceremony look like? Let us imagine one, based on descriptions from church court records and manor rolls that occasionally documented peasant life. The wedding itself would likely happen on a Sunday after church service because that was the one day peasants did not have to work in the fields. The local priest would perform the ceremony, a simple exchange of vows, probably at the church door rather than inside, because the interior of the church was reserved for more important occasions. There might be a small celebration afterward, but nothing elaborate. Perhaps some bread and cheese shared among family and close neighbours. Perhaps a barrel of weak ale, if the family could afford it. As evening approached, the bride and groom would make their way to their new home, which might be a single-room cottage with a dirt floor and a thatched roof. The bed would not be a carved masterpiece with silk curtains. It would be a simple wooden frame if they were lucky, or just a straw mattress on the floor. The witnesses to their bedding ceremony might be just 2 or 3 people. Perhaps the bride's mother. Perhaps a respected elder from the village. Perhaps the village reeve who served as a kind of local official. There would be no elaborate undressing in separate chambers, because there were no separate chambers. The bride and groom might step outside briefly to remove their outer garments while the witnesses waited inside, but that would be the extent of the privacy. When they returned, they would lie down on their simple bed while the witnesses stood nearby. One witness might say a simple prayer, might bless the couple with the sign of the cross, might sprinkle a bit of water, not holy water from a bishop, just regular water that someone had prayed over. Then the witnesses would leave, perhaps standing just outside the cottage door for a few minutes to establish that the couple was together, and then dispersing to their own homes. The entire ceremony might last 15 minutes. There would be no stockings thrown, no procession with music, no blessed wine in elaborate cups. Just a few neighbours bearing witness to the fact that yes, these 2 people went to bed together as husband and wife. But despite its simplicity, this ceremony served the same legal purpose as the most elaborate royal bedding. Those witnesses could testify, if needed, that the marriage had been properly completed. Their word might not carry the same weight in a court as a duke's testimony would, but in the village, among their peers, it was sufficient. However, there was a darker side to peasant bedding ceremonies that we need to acknowledge. Because peasants had so little privacy in their daily lives, often entire families shared single-room cottages, people worked communally in fields, medieval village life was intensely public. The idea of witnesses at a bedding was not necessarily as shocking to them as it would be to us. But this lack of privacy could also be weaponized. There are records from manor courts of cases where peasant couples were pressured into marriages they did not want because they had been caught together in circumstances that looked inappropriate. Remember what we discussed about Scotland, where finding an unmarried couple in bed together could result in them being declared married on the spot. This happened in peasant communities too, all across Europe. If a young man and young woman were found together in a barn or in a cottage alone, community pressure and sometimes actual legal force could compel them to marry. The bedding ceremony in these cases became not just a validation of a desired marriage, but a kind of social punishment, a way of enforcing community standards about sexual behaviour. Now, let us move up the social ladder to the merchants and skilled craftspeople, the blacksmiths, the weavers, the bakers, the shopkeepers who lived in medieval towns and cities. These people had more resources than peasants, but were not nobility. They occupied a middle ground, and their bedding ceremonies reflected that in-between status. A successful merchant might have a real bed with a wooden frame and possibly even curtains made of wool or linen. He might own a house with more than one room, which meant the bride could be dressed in one space while the groom prepared in another. The guest list for a merchant wedding would be larger than a peasant's, perhaps 20 to 30 people, including other guild members, important customers, relatives from nearby towns. There might be a proper feast with multiple courses, though nothing like the elaborate banquets of the nobility. The ale would be better quality. There might be wine if the family was particularly prosperous, and there would definitely be music. Perhaps just one or two musicians, but music nonetheless. For the bedding ceremony, the merchant couple would have an experience somewhere between peasant simplicity and noble elaboration. There would likely be a procession of sorts, guests accompanying the couple from the feast location to their house or room, singing songs that were probably bawdy but not as crude as some noble versions, because merchants had to maintain a certain respectability. The stocking game might be played, but with less formality. Witnesses would be present, but probably not in great numbers, maybe 5 or 6 trusted individuals rather than dozens. One fascinating aspect of the merchant bedding ceremonies was the importance of the bed itself as a status symbol. For peasants, a bed was simply functional, a place to sleep. For nobility, beds were political statements and family heirlooms. But for merchants, a bed was an investment, a marker of upward mobility. A merchant family might save for years to purchase or commission a really fine bed, one with carved headboard, proper mattress stuffed with feathers rather than straw, and good quality curtains. This bed would then be used for the wedding night with great ceremony, showing everyone in their social circle that the family had made it, that they were successful and prosperous. In some merchant communities, particularly in wealthy trading cities like Venice or Florence or Bruges, there was actually a tradition of lending or renting special wedding beds for important marriages. Families who owned particularly fine beds might loan them to friends or business associates for their children's weddings, for a price or as a favour. This meant that even a family of modest means might have their bedding ceremony in a truly impressive bed, one that elevated the entire occasion. The guests at the ceremony would recognise the bed, would know whose it was, and the implicit message was clear. This family is connected to important people. They have friends in high places. This marriage is backed by the community. But merchant bedding ceremonies also had a practical business-like quality that set them apart from both peasant and noble traditions. Merchant marriages were often business arrangements, uniting two trading families, combining resources, creating partnerships. The bedding ceremony witnesses were not just fulfilling a legal requirement, they were, in a sense, witnessing a business contract being finalized. Some of these witnesses might be fellow guild members who had a direct financial interest in the marriage, working out because it affected guild business or trade relationships. There are records from German merchant guilds of witnesses to bedding ceremonies signing actual documents afterward, formal statements that they had witnessed the couple being bedded together. These documents would be filed with guild records or town records, creating a paper trail that could be referenced years later if questions arose about the legitimacy of children or the validity of business partnerships that had been formed on the basis of the marriage. The merchants, in other words, were treating the bedding ceremony as a legal transaction that needed proper documentation, bringing their business sensibilities into even this intimate realm. Moving up another rung on the social ladder, we come to the lower nobility, knights, barons, minor lords who had titles and land but were not part of the highest aristocracy. These people faced an interesting challenge. They wanted to maintain the dignity and ceremony appropriate to their noble status, but they often lacked the resources to match truly wealthy nobles. Their bedding ceremonies became exercises in creative status display, showing that they belonged to the noble class even if they were not at its pinnacle. A minor noble might have only 1 or 2 good beds in their entire manor house. One would be the lord's bed, and it would be used for important occasions, including weddings. These beds were often family treasures passed down through generations, sometimes the most valuable piece of furniture the family owned. The bed would be prepared with special care for a wedding. The linens would be the finest the family possessed. Herbs would be scattered generously to cover any musty smells, and perhaps a nice blanket or coverlet would be borrowed from a wealthier neighbour to make the bed look more impressive. The ceremony itself would try to mimic higher noble traditions, but on a smaller scale. There might be a priest to bless the bed, but perhaps just the local parish priest rather than a bishop. There would be witnesses, but maybe 10 or 12 rather than dozens. Music would be present, but perhaps just one hired musician or talented family members playing instruments. The posset would be spiced wine, but in an ordinary cup rather than an elaborate golden goblet. Everything was a scaled-down version of what great nobles did, walking a fine line between maintaining noble dignity and not overspending the family's limited resources. What is particularly interesting about minor noble bedding ceremonies is how much they were driven by fear of being seen as inadequate. These families were acutely conscious of their place in the social hierarchy. They feared being mocked by the higher nobles for putting on airs, but they also feared being mistaken for commoners. The bedding ceremony became a careful performance of status, where every detail had to be just right, noble enough to be respectable, but not so elaborate as to seem like they were pretending to be more important than they actually were. And here is where we see something that cut across all social classes: the tradition of borrowing items for weddings. Peasants would borrow a better quality blanket from a wealthier neighbour. Merchants would borrow or rent fancy beds. Minor nobles would borrow silverware or nice linens from more established families. Even quite wealthy nobles sometimes borrowed items from royal households for their children's weddings. This widespread practice of borrowing tells us that the appearance of the bedding ceremony mattered tremendously, that families felt pressure to put on the best show they could manage, even if it meant using borrowed finery. But borrowing created its own complications. There are delightful records from various European cities of disputes over borrowed items not being returned or being returned damaged. One case from 15th century Nuremberg involved a family that had borrowed an expensive embroidered bed cover for their daughter's wedding. The bed cover was apparently ruined during the wedding night. We can only imagine how, and the lending family demanded compensation. The dispute ended up in court, with witnesses being questioned about the condition of the bed cover before and after the wedding, about whether the damage was normal wear or careless destruction. The court eventually ruled that the borrowing family had to pay for a new bed cover, a financial burden that must have taken them years to recover from. This brings us to another crucial difference between rich and poor bedding ceremonies: the economic burden. For peasants, the wedding and bedding ceremony were kept simple by necessity, so the financial impact was minimal. For wealthy nobles, the cost was enormous, but the family could afford it without hardship. But for people in the middle, prosperous merchants, minor nobles, successful craftspeople, the wedding, and especially the bedding ceremony, could be financially devastating. These families wanted to put on a good show, wanted to demonstrate their status and success, but they had to go into debt to do it. There are numerous records of families borrowing money to pay for weddings, taking out loans against future harvests or business profits, sometimes even selling land or property to fund a proper ceremony. The bedding ceremony was part of this expense. The good bed, the nice linens, the blessed wine, the payment for musicians and witnesses, the feast that had to continue late into the night. For some families, a wedding could represent the equivalent of a year's income or more. The financial pressure to perform this ceremony correctly, according to class expectations, was intense. And yet, despite all these differences in wealth and display, the basic structure remained the same. Whether you were a peasant with 2 witnesses and a straw mattress, or a duke with 50 witnesses and a gilded bed, the ceremony followed the same basic pattern. Witnesses present, couple placed in bed, some form of blessing or good wishes, and then privacy for consummation. The class differences affected the elaboration and expense, but not the fundamental purpose or structure. This tells us something important about medieval society. Yes, it was deeply hierarchical. Yes, the rich lived vastly different lives from the poor, but certain customs transcended class, taking different forms at different social levels while maintaining their core function. The bedding ceremony was one of those customs. It had to work for everyone, from the poorest serf to the king himself, because marriage was universal. Everyone needed to get married, everyone needed their marriages to be valid, and everyone needed witnesses who could testify to consummation if necessary. There is one more aspect of the class divide in bedding ceremonies that deserves attention: mobility and migration. When people married across class lines, which did happen, though rarely, or when people moved from one social class to another through success or misfortune, the bedding ceremony could become a site of confusion and sometimes conflict. If a merchant's daughter married into the lower nobility, whose traditions would the bedding ceremony follow? The merchant customs her family knew, or the noble traditions of her new husband's family? Usually the higher status family's traditions would prevail, but there are records of awkward compromises and cultural clashes. A bride from a merchant family might expect certain rituals that noble families considered beneath them. A noble groom marrying a merchant heiress might insist on the ceremonies that her family found wastefully elaborate. These negotiations about how many witnesses, what kind of bed, how elaborate the procession, were really negotiations about status, identity, and which family would dominate the new marriage. Similarly, when people moved between urban and rural settings, they brought their bedding ceremony expectations with them. A merchant who had grown wealthy might retire to a rural estate, and when his children married, the bedding ceremonies would be an interesting hybrid of urban merchant traditions and rural noble customs. Village peasants attending such a ceremony might be bewildered by urban practices they had never seen before, while the merchant family might feel uncomfortable with certain rural traditions they considered backward. All of these variations and complications reveal that the bedding ceremony, despite being a widespread custom across medieval Europe, was never monolithic. It was constantly being adapted, negotiated, shaped by the local conditions and class expectations. The basic idea, witnesses to consummation to validate marriage, remained constant, but the implementation varied wildly depending on who you were, where you lived, and how much money you had. And perhaps that flexibility, that ability to scale the ceremony to match different circumstances, is part of why it persisted for so long. A custom that worked only for the very wealthy would have died out when it could not adapt to common people. A custom that worked only for peasants would have been rejected by nobility, who needed something more impressive. But the bedding ceremony worked for everyone, at every level of society, because it could be as simple or as elaborate as needed while still serving its core function. Now that we have seen how the ceremony varied across social classes, how wealth and status shaped the experience in profound ways, we are ready to confront another aspect of this tradition: resistance. Because not everyone accepted bedding ceremonies willingly. Not every bride and groom meekly submitted to having witnesses in their bedroom. Some people fought back, refused, found ways to avoid or minimize this invasion of privacy, and their stories of resistance, of rebellion against this deeply entrenched custom, reveal the beginning of the end for the bedding ceremony tradition itself. There is something quietly heroic about the moment when someone looks at a centuries-old tradition, a custom so entrenched that everyone assumes it is inevitable, and simply says, "No, not tonight, not in my bedroom." In the long history of bedding ceremonies, most couples submitted because they saw no alternative. But some resisted, some fought back, some found creative ways to avoid the most invasive aspects of this custom. And their stories of defiance, small and large, help us understand how traditions that seem immovable can eventually crack and crumble when enough people decide they have had enough. Our first rebel is a king. The year is 1625, and Charles Stuart, newly crowned as King Charles I of England, has just married Princess Henrietta Maria of France. This is a major political marriage, uniting Protestant England with Catholic France, and expectations for proper ceremony are high. The wedding feast has been magnificent. The guests are assembled. The traditional bedding ceremony is about to begin, with all its elaborate ritual and dozens of noble witnesses, and then Charles does something that shocks everyone present. He walks to the door of the bedchamber, steps inside with his new bride, and bars the door from the inside. He physically locks out the witnesses. The assembled nobles stand outside, stunned. This is not how it is done. This is not how a king behaves. But Charles has made his decision, and no amount of protest will change it. Why did Charles refuse the bedding ceremony? Contemporary accounts suggest several reasons. Some historians think he was simply embarrassed by the prospect of such public intimacy. Charles was known to be shy and awkward in social situations, deeply uncomfortable with anything that felt undignified or improper. The idea of being watched, even symbolically, might have been intolerable to him. Others suggest that he was making a political statement, asserting his royal prerogative to do as he pleased regardless of tradition. Still others think Henrietta Maria, his strong-willed French bride, might have objected to the ceremony, and Charles supported her wishes. Whatever the reason, Charles set a precedent. He was a king, the most powerful person in England, and he had refused the bedding ceremony. If a king could say no, could not other people start questioning whether this custom was really necessary? But here is the fascinating and somewhat depressing part. Despite Charles's refusal, despite his royal example, the bedding ceremony continued in England for another century. It remained prevalent across all social classes, just as elaborate and invasive as before. One king's resistance was not enough to end a tradition that was woven into the social fabric of an entire continent. Charles was not the first person to resist, though he might have been the most prominent. Church records and court documents from across medieval Europe occasionally mention couples who refused the proper bedding or who did not permit witnesses as is customary. These brief mentions hint at small rebellions that have been mostly lost to history. A bride who locked herself in her room and would not come out. A groom who sent the witnesses away forcefully. A couple who simply disappeared after the feast, slipping away to consummate their marriage privately before anyone could organize a bedding ceremony. What happened to these rebels? The consequences varied. For commoners, refusing the bedding ceremony could result in their marriage being questioned. If no witnesses could testify to the bedding, later disputes about legitimacy or inheritance could be much harder to resolve. the couple was taking a risk, gambling that their marriage would never be challenged, that they would never need those witnesses. For some, this gamble paid off. They lived their lives without incident, and the lack of bedding ceremony witnesses never mattered. For others, it came back to haunt them years later, when a dispute arose and they had no witnesses to call upon. For nobility, refusing the bedding ceremony could cause a minor scandal, but was less likely to have serious legal consequences. Noble families had other ways to establish legitimacy: documented contracts, multiple forms of property records, witnesses to other aspects of the marriage. A noble couple who refused the bedding might face gossip and disapproval, but they were unlikely to have their marriage declared invalid because of it. There were also couples who participated in bedding ceremonies but found creative ways to minimize the invasion. Some would allow witnesses to see them enter the bed, would go through all the ceremonial steps, but would use heavy bed curtains and stay completely clothed under the covers, waiting until the witnesses left before actually undressing. Others would time everything carefully, calculating exactly how long they needed to stay in the bed to satisfy the witnesses before the guests would finally disperse. Few clever couples reportedly arranged to have an emergency arise shortly after the bedding began. A sudden illness, an urgent message, some crisis that required the witnesses to leave immediately. One particularly amusing account from 16th century France describes a bride who, after being placed in the marriage bed with her new husband, promptly announced that she needed to use the privy, immediately, urgently. The witnesses, caught between the requirements of ceremony and basic human decency, had to let her leave the bed. She took her time, and when she finally returned, the awkward momentum of the ceremony had been broken. The witnesses were tired and uncomfortable and mostly just wanted to leave. The couple was able to shorten the whole ordeal considerably through this simple act of biological rebellion. But perhaps the most interesting form of resistance was negotiation. Before some marriages, particularly among wealthy merchants and lower nobility, the terms of the wedding ceremony would be negotiated as part of the marriage contract. These contracts might specify how many witnesses could attend the bedding, exactly which individuals would be allowed, how long they could stay, what they could and could not do. In effect, couples were creating boundaries using legal agreements to limit the invasiveness of a custom they could not eliminate entirely. These pre-negotiated bedding ceremonies reveal something important. Even in medieval times, even when this custom was at its height, people understood that it was uncomfortable and wanted to minimize that discomfort if possible. They were not blindly following tradition. They were negotiating, compromising, trying to balance social expectations with personal dignity. A couple might agree to allow 5 witnesses instead of refusing witnesses entirely. They might agree to the ceremony but insist it last no more than 15 minutes. They might allow certain respected elders to witness but forbid young relatives who might gossip. Church officials occasionally found themselves in the middle of these negotiations, and their responses reveal the tension between tradition and changing attitudes. Some priests insisted on the full traditional ceremony, arguing that anything less would invalidate the marriage or at least make it questionable. Others were more flexible, recognizing that forcing unwilling couples through an ordeal might do more harm than good. There are records of bishops issuing guidance to priests about how to handle couples who objected to bedding ceremonies, essentially creating bureaucratic procedures for resistance. One such guideline from a 15th century German diocese specified that if a couple objected to a bedding ceremony, the priest should first attempt to explain why it was important and necessary. If the couple still objected, the priest could perform a modified ceremony with minimal witnesses, just 2 instead of many, and abbreviated rituals. If the couple absolutely refused even this minimal ceremony, the priest should document their refusal in writing, have them sign the document, and proceed with recording the marriage anyway. This created a paper trail showing that the couple had been offered the traditional ceremony and had consciously chosen to refuse it. This kind of documented refusal was actually a form of legal protection, both for the couple and for the church. It meant that if someone later challenged the marriage, the couple could not claim they had never been offered a proper bedding ceremony, and it meant the church could not be accused of failing to offer the traditional rites. Everyone's interests were protected through paperwork, which is a very medieval solution to a delicate problem. The resistance to bedding ceremonies also took the form of parody and humour. In some regions, particularly in France and parts of Italy, there developed traditions of mock bedding ceremonies where the invasive aspects were exaggerated to the point of absurdity. During carnival seasons or other festivals, young people would stage fake weddings with deliberately ridiculous bedding ceremonies, perhaps 50 witnesses crowding into a tiny room, or witnesses offering the couple absurd items like onions instead of wine, or conducting the ceremony in Pig Latin. These parodies served as social commentary, a way of saying, "Look how ridiculous this tradition is," without directly challenging it. Humour was a safe way to express discomfort with the custom. You could laugh at the absurdity of throwing stockings at a couple in bed. You could make jokes about priests blessing beds. You could create parodies of the ceremony, and all of this was acceptable because it was framed as entertainment. But underneath the humour was genuine critique, a sense that this custom had become too invasive, too uncomfortable, too out of step with changing ideas about privacy and dignity. Women in particular found ways to resist or at least cope with bedding ceremonies that they found traumatic. Some medieval advice books written for women contained suggestions for how to endure the ceremony with grace. Focus your mind on spiritual thoughts. Remember that it will soon be over. Take comfort in the fact that all married women have gone through this. But there are also hints of more active resistance strategies. Women helping younger women prepare for their wedding nights might whisper advice about how to appear modest while actually maintaining some control, how to use the bed curtains strategically, how to signal to witnesses that it was time for them to leave. Older women, particularly those who had been through traumatic bedding ceremonies themselves, sometimes became advocates for reducing the invasiveness of the custom. A wealthy widow with social influence might refuse to serve as a witness for bedding ceremonies, making it clear that she found the practice distasteful. A mother preparing her daughter for marriage might negotiate with the groom's family for a more private ceremony. These small acts of resistance, multiplied across thousands of families over centuries, gradually shifted expectations about what was acceptable. There is a particular poignancy in reading court records of annulment cases where women testified about their wedding nights. Sometimes these testimonies reveal resistance that went unrecognized at the time. A woman describing how she could not bring herself to fulfill her wifely duties might have been asserting agency, refusing to consummate a marriage she never wanted. A woman testifying that the bedding ceremony was never completed as is customary might have been documenting her own quiet rebellion. The historical record does not always tell us whether these were acts of resistance or simply failures of consummation, but we should at least consider the possibility that some medieval women found ways to say no, even in a system designed to give them no choice. Men too had their forms of resistance, though the social dynamics were different. A groom who was uncomfortable with the bedding ceremony faced different pressures than a bride. He was expected to be eager, virile, capable. For a man to resist or refuse the ceremony might be interpreted as weakness or inability, which carried its own shame. But some men did resist, particularly educated men influenced by new philosophical ideas about dignity and privacy. During the Renaissance, as humanist ideas spread across Europe, some intellectuals began questioning traditions like bedding ceremonies. They asked, is this really necessary? Does it serve justice or just satisfy prurient curiosity? Is there a more dignified way to validate marriages? These questions, asked in universities and debated in scholarly treatises, began to filter down into popular consciousness. A merchant who had studied at university might return to his hometown with new ideas about marriage and refuse the traditional bedding ceremony, citing philosophical arguments about natural rights and human dignity. The Reformation accelerated this process. Protestant reformers, with their emphasis on direct relationship with God unmediated by church ritual, often viewed elaborate ceremonies skeptically. Martin Luther and other reformers wrote about marriage in terms that emphasized the couple's commitment to each other and to God, not the community's witnessing of consummation. While Protestant regions did not immediately abandon bedding ceremonies, remember the legal need for witnesses remained. They began to simplify and reduce them, stripping away the most elaborate and invasive elements. But perhaps the most effective form of resistance was simply attrition. Couples quietly having less elaborate ceremonies than their parents had, or their parents were poor parents. Each generation might reduce the ceremony slightly. A family that once had 20 witnesses might have only 12. A ceremony that once lasted 2 hours might be shortened to 1. These incremental changes, almost imperceptible from one generation to the next, accumulated over time into substantial transformation. And yet, for all this resistance, for all these small rebellions and negotiations and creative avoidances, the bedding ceremony persisted. It adapted, it changed, it became less elaborate in some places and times, but it did not disappear quickly. Even King Charles I's famous refusal did not end the practice. For another 100 years after he barred that bedchamber door, English couples continued to have bedding ceremonies with witnesses. French couples still processed to beds with musicians and observers. German couples still had their sheets inspected in the morning. Why was resistance so difficult? Why could this custom not be overthrown more quickly? The answer lies in the interconnected nature of medieval social institutions. The bedding ceremony was not just a tradition. It was tied to legal systems, to property rights, to inheritance law, to the very structure of how marriage worked. You could not easily eliminate one part without disrupting the whole system. The witnesses to bedding ceremonies were witnesses for legal purposes, protection against future disputes. To eliminate them, you would need alternative systems of legal validation, alternative ways to prove marriage and legitimacy, and those alternatives developed slowly over centuries as literacy increased, as record-keeping improved, as legal institutions became more sophisticated. So the resistance continued, generation after generation, small acts of defiance accumulating into gradual change. Each couple who refused or modified the ceremony made it slightly easier for the next couple to do the same. Each public figure who expressed discomfort with the custom, a king barring his door, a bishop writing guidelines for minimal ceremonies, gave others permission to question what they had always assumed was inevitable. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, but with increasing speed, the custom began to crumble. By the late 1600s, bedding ceremonies were becoming noticeably less common among educated urban populations, even though they remained entrenched in rural areas and among more conservative families. By the early 1700s, new alternatives were emerging: written marriage certificates, improved parish records, legal systems that did not require witness testimony for routine matters. The foundation that had supported bedding ceremonies for centuries was eroding, and the custom was beginning to collapse under its own weight. But understanding this collapse, understanding how and why this centuries-old tradition finally died, requires us to step back and look at the broader forces that were reshaping European society. Changes in philosophy, in religion, in law, in economics, in daily life, all of these came together to make bedding ceremonies first questionable, then optional, and finally obsolete. The rebels and resistors we have been discussing were not just expressing personal preference. They were responding to and accelerating larger historical forces that were transforming what it meant to be married, what privacy meant, what individuals could expect from their communities and what communities could demand from individuals. Imagine for a moment that you could speak with someone from medieval Europe, could sit down with a bride from 1450 and explain to her that in our modern world wedding nights are completely private. No witnesses, no processions, no crowds, just the couple alone in a room where no one else is allowed. How do you think she would react? Would she be relieved, grateful, or would she perhaps feel a bit frightened, wondering how such a marriage could possibly be valid without witnesses, how anyone would know it had truly been completed? This thought experiment reveals something profound. What we consider normal privacy, what we assume is a universal human need, is actually a relatively recent invention. The medieval concept of privacy was fundamentally different from ours, and understanding that difference is the key to comprehending how bedding ceremonies could ever have seemed acceptable, even necessary. Let us start with the most basic fact. Medieval people did not live private lives in any sense that we would recognize. Privacy as we understand it, the right to be alone, to have spaces and moments that belong only to you, to control who sees you and when, simply did not exist for most of human history. It is a modern concept, born from specific historical developments, and its absence shaped every aspect of medieval life in ways that are difficult for us to fully grasp. Consider the medieval house, even for relatively wealthy families. What we call rooms in the modern sense, enclosed spaces with specific purposes, doors that lock, designated for particular activities, were rare. Instead, medieval houses were organized around great halls, large open spaces where multiple activities happened simultaneously. Eating, working, socializing, even sleeping often happened in the same physical space, just at different times of day. Servants slept in the same rooms as their masters, sometimes on the floor beside the great bed. Children shared sleeping spaces with parents and siblings. Guests staying overnight would be accommodated wherever space could be found, often in rooms already occupied by family members. Even wealthy nobles, living in castles and manor houses, had limited privacy. A noble's bedchamber might have a door, yes, but that door was rarely closed and almost never locked. Servants came and went constantly, bringing water, stoking fires, delivering messages, helping with dressing and undressing. The concept of a bedroom as a private sanctuary where you could be alone with your spouse did not exist. Your bedroom was a semi-public space where your personal servants had constant access and where important visitors might be received. This meant that medieval people grew up never being alone in ways that would be normal for us. They bathed with others present. They used chamber pots or privies that offered minimal privacy. They slept in rooms with multiple people. They worked surrounded by family members or fellow workers. The idea that you might want or need to be completely alone, with no one watching you or listening to you, would have seemed strange, even suspicious. What were you hiding? What were you planning? Solitude was associated with hermits and mystics, people who had deliberately removed themselves from normal society, not with ordinary people going about their daily lives. When you understand this background, the bedding ceremony starts to make more sense, not as an invasion of privacy, but as a normal extension of communal living. If you had never been truly alone in your life, if every significant moment had been witnessed by family or community members, why would your wedding night be any different? In fact, the wedding night being public made it consistent with everything else in medieval life. The unusual thing, from a medieval perspective, would have been for it to be private. But there is more to this than just physical living arrangements. Medieval people also thought about themselves differently than we do. The modern concept of the individual, The idea that each person is a separate, autonomous entity with inherent rights and personal boundaries was not the dominant way medieval people understood themselves. Instead, they saw themselves primarily as members of groups, a family, a village, a guild, a manor, a parish. Your identity came from your place in these social networks, not from your individual uniqueness. This communal sense of self meant that the boundaries between me and we were much more fluid than they are for us. Your business was the community's business. Your successes belonged to your family. Your failures brought shame to your group. The idea that you had a right to privacy, that there were aspects of your life that were nobody's business but your own, would have seemed nonsensical. Everything was everybody's business. Because you were not really a separate individual, you were a component of the community. Marriage in this context was never just about two individuals. It was about families joining, property merging, alliances forming, new branches being added to family trees. The consummation of the marriage was not your private moment. It was the community's moment, the culmination of negotiations and preparations that had involved dozens of people. Of course, the community wanted to witness it. They had been involved in every other step. Why would this final step be different? Anthropologists who study concepts of privacy across cultures have found that the European medieval period represents one extreme on a spectrum. At one end, you have societies like medieval Europe, where privacy is minimal and most of life is communal. At the other end, you have modern Western societies where privacy is considered a fundamental right and solitude is normal. Most human societies throughout history have been somewhere in the middle, but few have been as communal as medieval Europe or as privacy-focused as modern America or Western Europe. What caused the shift from communal living to privacy-focused living? The change happened gradually over several centuries, driven by multiple interlocking factors. Let us explore some of the most important ones, because understanding why privacy became valued helps us understand why bedding ceremonies eventually became intolerable. First, there were physical changes in how people lived. Beginning in the late medieval period and accelerating during the Renaissance, house architecture began to change. Wealthy families started building houses with more rooms, with corridors connecting those rooms, with doors that could be closed. The modern floor plan, where each room has a specific purpose and access, can be controlled, emerged during this period. Once you have a house where bedrooms are actually private spaces, the idea of filling that bedroom with witnesses starts to seem more invasive than it did when bedrooms were semi-public spaces anyway. Urbanization played a role as well. As more people moved to cities, as medieval villages gave way to early modern towns, the nature of community changed. In a small village where everyone has known everyone else for generations, communal witnessing of important events makes sense. These are people you trust, people who are genuinely invested in your well-being. But in a city where you might not know your neighbours well, where communities are larger and more impersonal, having strangers witness your intimate moments becomes uncomfortable in new ways. The familiarity that made communal rituals feel safe erodes in urban settings. Literacy and the spread of writing also contributed to the rise of privacy. As more people learned to read and write, as written records became more common and reliable, the need for human witnesses decreased. Why did you need witnesses to testify about your bedding ceremony if you had a written marriage certificate, signed by officials recorded in church registries? The development of bureaucratic systems for recording marriages, births, deaths, and property transactions meant that human memory became less crucial as a form of evidence. You could prove things with documents instead of witnesses. Religious changes mattered enormously as well. The Protestant Reformation, with its emphasis on individual conscience and direct relationship with God, contributed to new ways of thinking about the self. If each person had their own unique relationship with God, if salvation depended on personal faith rather than communal religious practice, then maybe each person was more of an autonomous individual than previous generations had believed. This theological shift had social implications, including new ideas about personal privacy and individual rights. The Enlightenment accelerated this process dramatically. Enlightenment philosophers wrote extensively about natural rights, individual liberty, and personal autonomy. They argued that there were aspects of human life that should be protected from intrusion, even by legitimate authorities. The idea that you owned yourself, that your body and your intimate relationships belonged to you and not to the community or the state, gained intellectual credibility and eventually popular acceptance. Economic changes were crucial as well. The rise of capitalism and market economies changed how people related to each other. In a traditional village economy, everyone depends on everyone else in direct personal ways. The baker needs the farmer, who needs the blacksmith, who needs the weaver. But in a market economy, relationships become more abstract, more based on contracts and money than on personal obligations. This economic individualism reinforced social individualism. If you are an economic agent who can make contracts independently, maybe you are also a social agent who can control your own intimate life. All of these factors, architectural changes, urbanization, literacy, religious reformation, philosophical enlightenment, economic transformation, combined to create a society where privacy became valued, expected, and eventually considered a right. And as privacy became important, bedding ceremonies became intolerable. What had once seemed normal and necessary now seemed like an outrageous violation. The same ceremony, the same actions, but viewed through a completely different psychological and social lens. There is something almost tragic about this transformation when we think about it from the perspective of people living through it. Imagine being part of a generation caught between two worlds. Your grandparents had bedding ceremonies and thought nothing of it. Your parents had bedding ceremonies but maybe felt a bit uncomfortable about it. And now you're supposed to have one, but everything you have learned about dignity and privacy makes the idea horrifying. You are not just rejecting a ceremony, you are navigating a fundamental shift in how humans understand themselves and each other. This is why the decline of bedding ceremonies was so gradual, so uneven. It was not just about changing a custom, it required changing the entire psychological framework through which people understood privacy, intimacy, and community. Some regions and social classes made this transition faster than others. Urban educated elites, influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and living in houses with private rooms, abandoned bedding ceremonies relatively quickly in the 1700s. Rural peasants, still living in communal ways, still tied to traditional village life, might continue some version of the ceremony into the 1800s or even early 1900s in remote areas. And here is something fascinating. Even as bedding ceremonies disappeared, even as privacy became valued, people still felt the loss of something the ceremonies had provided. They had provided community validation, social support, a sense that your marriage was not just your private concern, but something your whole community celebrated and supported. When marriages became completely private, when wedding nights belonged only to the couple, some of that communal warmth disappeared. This is why wedding receptions and other collective wedding rituals persisted and even intensified even as bedding ceremonies vanished. We still want our communities involved in our marriages. We still want witnesses to our commitment, just not to our consummation. The modern wedding reception, with its toasts and dances and collective celebration, serves some of the same social functions that the bedding ceremony once served. It makes the marriage a community event, creates shared memories, involves people beyond just the couple. We have found ways to be communal about marriage while respecting privacy about intimacy, but this required developing new rituals to replace the old ones. There is also something we can learn from examining this historical shift, something relevant to our own time. We live in an era of social media where people voluntarily share aspects of their lives that previous generations would have considered intensely private. Photos of intimate moments, details of relationships, personal struggles and triumphs, all shared publicly, witnessed by hundreds or thousands of people. In some ways, we are recreating a communal witnessing of private life, but voluntarily, with control over what we share and with whom. Is this so different from medieval communal living? In both cases, private life becomes public in certain ways, but there is a crucial difference: choice. Modern people choose what to share and can stop sharing whenever they want. Medieval people had no such choice. Their lives were communal not by preference but by necessity, by social structure, by physical living conditions that made privacy impossible. The bedding ceremony was mandatory witnessing. Social media is optional sharing. That difference, the presence or absence of genuine consent and control, is what makes all the difference between oppression and connection. Looking at medieval bedding ceremonies through this psychological lens, understanding the fundamentally different concept of privacy and self, helps us avoid the trap of thinking medieval people were simply less civilized or less sensitive than we are. They were not. They were responding rationally to their circumstances, creating social systems that made sense given how they lived and how they understood themselves. The bedding ceremony worked for them in ways it could never work for us, not because they were inferior, but because they were different, living in a different social and psychological world. And recognizing this difference, acknowledging that concepts we consider universal and timeless, like privacy and individual rights, are actually historically contingent, culturally specific, and relatively recent, should make us humble. It should make us wonder what aspects of our current life might seem as strange to people a few centuries from now, as bedding ceremonies seem to us. What are we doing right now? What customs are we following that future generations will look back on and struggle to comprehend? This humility, this recognition that our way of living is not the only way or the inevitable way, is perhaps the most valuable lesson we can draw from studying medieval bedding ceremonies. They show us that human societies can organize intimacy, privacy, and community in radically different ways, and that what seems obviously right to us might have seemed obviously wrong to our ancestors, and vice versa. We are all products of our time, shaped by historical forces we barely understand, following customs that feel natural but are actually contingent. And with this understanding of how profoundly privacy concepts differ across time and culture, we are ready to explore how bedding ceremonies varied not just across time, but across space. How did different regions of Europe adapt this custom to their local conditions and beliefs? What can the regional variations tell us about the diversity of medieval Europe, about how local culture shaped even the most intimate customs? Let us take a journey across the medieval map and discover how bedding ceremonies looked, from Iceland to Italy, from Ireland to the edges of the Byzantine world. Medieval Europe was not a monolith. It was a patchwork quilt of languages, laws, customs, and beliefs, stitched together by Christianity but retaining fierce local identities. A farmer in Norway and a farmer in southern Italy might both be Christian, might both be subject to similar church teachings about marriage, but their daily lives, their assumptions about the world, their deepest cultural instincts were profoundly different. And nowhere were these differences more visible than in how various regions adapted the bedding ceremony to their local conditions. Let us embark on a journey across medieval Europe, stopping in different regions to see how this one custom took on strikingly different flavors depending on where you were, revealing the beautiful and sometimes bizarre diversity of medieval life. We begin our journey in the far north, in Iceland, where we have already encountered the strict legal requirement for 6 male witnesses. But Iceland's bedding ceremonies had other unique features that set them apart from anywhere else in Europe. Remember, Iceland was settled relatively late, the 9th and 10th centuries, by Vikings who brought with them a curious mixture of Old Norse traditions and newly adopted Christianity. The result was a culture that was simultaneously deeply legal-minded and intensely pragmatic. Icelandic sagas, those remarkable literary works written down in the 13th and 14th centuries but describing events from earlier periods, occasionally mention wedding customs. What is striking about Icelandic bedding ceremonies is their utter lack of romanticism. The sagas describe them in the same matter-of-fact tone used for describing property transactions, because that is essentially what they were. The bedding was the final step in a marriage contract, the moment when the deal was sealed. Witnesses gathered not for celebration but for documentation, their presence a legal formality rather than a social event. One saga describes a bedding ceremony, where the 6 required witnesses stood outside the sleeping chamber, counting to a certain number, some sources suggest 1,000, before considering their duty fulfilled. This time counting served as proof that enough time had elapsed for consummation to reasonably occur. Can you imagine standing outside someone's bedroom, counting slowly to 1,000? The witnesses would have been out there for perhaps 15 minutes or more, in the Icelandic cold, fulfilling their legal obligation with grim, Viking determination. There is something both absurd and admirable about this, reducing the mystery and emotion of a wedding night to a mathematical exercise in time measurement. Iceland's long winter nights also affected bedding ceremonies in practical ways. Winter weddings, which were common because agricultural work did not demand attention during that season, meant bedding ceremonies happened in near total darkness, broken only by dim oil lamps or candles. The cold was intense. Remember, Icelandic houses were made of turf and stone with minimal heating. The witnesses counting outside would have been huddled against the wind, breathing out clouds of frost, probably very motivated to count quickly so they could go home to their own warm beds. Now, let us travel south and west to Norway and the broader Scandinavian region. Here, bedding ceremonies retained stronger connections to pre-Christian Norse traditions. The most distinctive Norwegian variation was the role of the bride leading, where the most distinguished guest at the wedding, usually a wealthy landowner or an important relative, would personally escort the bride to the marriage bed in a formal procession. This was considered such an honour that it could be mentioned in family histories for generations afterward. It was Olaf Haraldsson who led my great-grandmother to her marriage bed, was the kind of statement that conveyed immense status. These Norwegian processions could be quite elaborate despite the harsh northern climate. Torches would light the way through dark winter nights. Musicians would play, not the refined courtly music of southern Europe, but traditional Nordic instruments like the langalik, a kind of zither, or the tagelharpa, a bowed lyre. The songs were often very old, with roots in pre-Christian times, though by the medieval period the words had been Christianized. But the melodies carried echoes of ancient fertility rites, of sacrifices to Norse gods who were now forbidden, but not entirely forgotten. There was also a unique Norwegian custom of offering the newlyweds food during the bedding ceremony. Unlike the Scandinavian practice we mentioned earlier of simply bringing dishes, the Norwegian variation involved specific ceremonial foods with symbolic meanings. Buttered flatbread represented prosperity. Salted fish represented preservation. May this marriage endure like salted fish endures the winter. Honey represented sweetness in the relationship. The couple was expected to eat a small amount of each food while the distinguished guest and other witnesses observed, making the bedding ceremony also a ritual meal, a communion of sorts. Let us journey now across the North Sea to Ireland, where bedding ceremonies took on distinctly Celtic characteristics layered over Christian practice. The Irish, recently converted to Christianity in medieval terms, had strong memories of pre-Christian traditions and found ways to incorporate them into Christian rituals. Irish bedding ceremonies often involved what were called protection rituals, practices meant to ward off fairies and evil spirits who might curse the marriage bed. An Irish bride might have her hair braided in a specific protective pattern before the bedding ceremony, with red thread woven through to confuse malevolent fairies. Salt might be scattered under the marriage bed, because Irish folk belief held that fairies could not cross salt lines. The priest blessing the bed would often include prayers not just for fertility, but specifically for protection against the Eos Sea, the fairy folk who in Irish belief were always looking for opportunities to cause mischief or steal away beautiful brides. These Irish additions to the bedding ceremony were technically unauthorized by the Church. Rome did not approve of fairy beliefs, considered them superstitious remnants of paganism that should be stamped out. But Irish priests living in communities where fairy belief was universal and taken absolutely seriously pragmatically incorporated these elements into church rituals. Better to Christianize fairy protection than to try to eliminate beliefs that were simply too deeply rooted to remove. Now we move east to the Germanic lands, modern Germany, Austria, parts of Switzerland, where bedding ceremonies were perhaps the most elaborate and theatrical of anywhere in Europe. We have already mentioned the obscene noises and excessive music of German ceremonies, but there was more to it than that. Germanic regions developed an entire subculture around wedding bedding, with specialized songs, specific rituals, even professional wedding fools, who could be hired to make the ceremony more entertaining. A typical German bedding ceremony in a prosperous town might involve a parade through the streets before reaching the house where the couple would be bedded. Neighbours would open their windows to watch and cheer. The wedding fool, dressed in motley clothing with bells, would lead the procession, making jokes and comic commentary. Some of these jokes were genuinely funny, wordplay, amusing observations about married life. Others were crude sexual innuendo. The fool walked a line between entertainment and offensiveness, and a skilled wedding fool was highly valued because he could keep the mood light and reduce the couple's anxiety without going so far as to cause actual offence. Germanic ceremonies also featured something called the bride's ransom. Before the couple could be brought to the bed, friends of the groom would pretend to kidnap the bride, taking her to a different room and demanding the groom pay a ransom, usually a round of drinks for everyone present, before she would be returned. This playful kidnapping was meant to demonstrate that the bride was valuable, that the groom had to prove his worthiness to receive her, but it also extended the ceremony, building anticipation and giving the couple more time to prepare themselves mentally for what was coming. Travelling south to France, we find yet another variation. French bedding ceremonies, especially in the more cosmopolitan cities like Paris or Lyon, were noted for their focus on elegance and refinement. While other regions might emphasize rowdy celebration or legal formality, the French tried to make the bedding ceremony as graceful and aesthetically pleasing as possible. The processions were choreographed almost like dances. The songs, while still bawdy in content, were sung in harmonies and set to sophisticated melodies. Even the bawdy jokes were delivered with wit rather than crudeness. This French emphasis on elegance was partly about class aspiration. The French bourgeoisie, the rising merchant and professional classes desperately wanted to be seen as refined and cultured, as worthy of mixing with the nobility. An elegant bedding ceremony was a way of demonstrating that you had sophisticated taste, that you understood proper etiquette, that you belonged in elevated social circles. A wealthy merchant might spend considerable money hiring musicians and training attendants to ensure that his daughter's bedding ceremony was performed with maximum grace and style. But there was also a distinctly French element of romantic idealization mixed into these ceremonies. While most European bedding ceremonies were practical witnesses for legal purposes, community validation, property transaction documentation, French ceremonies sometimes attempted to frame the bedding in more romantic terms. The songs might speak of love conquering all, of the joy of union, of soulmates destined to be together. This romantic overlay did not eliminate the invasive aspects of having witnesses, but it attempted to reframe them as celebrating love rather than just documenting a transaction. Crossing the Pyrenees into Spain, we encounter bedding ceremonies shaped by the unique Spanish situation of religious diversity and conflict. Medieval Spain was a region where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in close proximity, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. Christian bedding ceremonies in Spain were often more explicitly religious than elsewhere, perhaps as a way of emphasizing Christian identity in a mixed religious landscape. Spanish bedding ceremonies might involve extended prayers, multiple priests rather than just one, more holy water, more blessings. The religious elements were performed in Spanish or Latin rather than local dialects, emphasizing connection to the universal Catholic Church. And there was often an undercurrent of fertility emphasis even more intense than other regions. Spanish couples were producing Christian children who would strengthen Christian Spain against Muslim and Jewish neighbours. The bedding ceremony was not just about two people, but about the demographic future of Christian Iberia. Interestingly, there is some evidence that Muslim and Jewish communities in Spain developed their own parallel bedding customs, influenced by Christian practice but adapted to their own religious requirements. Jewish bedding ceremonies would have been governed by Jewish law regarding marital intimacy, which has different requirements than Christian law. Muslim bedding ceremonies would have been shaped by Islamic marriage customs. These communities were watching their Christian neighbours, borrowing some elements, adapting others, creating hybrid customs that existed in the cultural mixing bowl of medieval Spain. Venturing into Italy, we find perhaps the most diverse regional variations anywhere, because Italy in medieval times was not a unified country but a collection of independent city-states, kingdoms and republics, each with its own character. A bedding ceremony in Venice looked quite different from one in Rome, which looked different from one in Sicily, which looked different from one in Florence. Venetian bedding ceremonies, befitting a maritime trading empire, often incorporated elements borrowed from the East. Venetian merchants traded extensively with the Byzantine Empire and beyond, and they brought back customs and ideas. Some wealthy Venetian families used incense during bedding ceremonies, not just the Christian incense used in church, but exotic perfumes from Arabia and India. The bedchamber might be hung with silk fabrics purchased from Eastern traders. The aesthetic was more ornate, more sensual, more influenced by cultures beyond Europe than anywhere else on the continent. Rome, being the seat of the papacy, had bedding ceremonies that were under particularly intense scrutiny from church authorities. Roman families had to be careful to follow every church rule precisely, because they lived under the eyes of cardinals and bishops who could judge them for any deviation from proper practice. This made Roman bedding ceremonies perhaps the most by the book of anywhere in Catholic Europe, very traditional, very conservative, very concerned with appearing orthodox and respectable. Sicilian bedding ceremonies, meanwhile, showed influence from both North African and Byzantine cultures due to the island's complex history of conquest and trade. There are records of Sicilian weddings incorporating practices that seem unusual for Christian Europe. For instance, the bride being kept veiled not just for modesty but for protection against the evil eye, a concept common in Mediterranean cultures but not typically associated with Northern European Christianity. Witnesses at Sicilian bedding ceremonies might make specific gestures or say specific phrases meant to protect the couple from magical harm. Florence and the other Tuscan city-states developed bedding ceremonies with a strong emphasis on civic participation. These were republican cities, governed by guilds and councils rather than by kings or nobles, and civic identity was intensely important. A Florentine bedding ceremony might involve witnesses specifically chosen to represent different guilds, one representative from the silk weavers, one from the bankers, one from the physicians, and so on. The marriage was being validated not just by individuals but by the city's corporate structure, by the institutions that made Florence function. What all these regional variations reveal is that while bedding ceremonies shared a common purpose across Europe, validating marriages through witness testimony, they were deeply shaped by local culture, climate, religion, politics, and history. The ceremony was a canvas onto which each region painted its own concerns, its own aesthetics, its own identity. An Icelander, counting to 1,000 in the cold darkness, and a Florentine guild representative bearing witness in a silk-draped chamber were performing the same basic function, but in ways so different they almost seem like different customs entirely. And this regional diversity actually helped the bedding ceremony persist for as long as it did. Because the custom was flexible, because it could be adapted to local conditions and sensibilities, it could survive in many different contexts. A uniform, rigid custom imposed from above might have been rejected, but a custom that each region could make its own, could shape according to local needs and preferences, had staying power. The diversity was a source of strength, at least for a time, but eventually that diversity could not prevent the custom's decline, because the forces that would end bedding ceremonies, changing ideas about privacy, improving legal documentation, shifting concepts of individual rights, operated at a level deeper than regional variation. No matter how you dressed it up, no matter what local flavour you added, the bedding ceremony remained fundamentally invasive in ways that newer ideas about human dignity could not accept. And so across all of Europe, from Iceland to Italy, from Ireland to the edges of the Byzantine world, the custom began to fade. Not all at once, not uniformly but inexorably, like a tide slowly receding from shores it had covered for centuries. Every tradition, no matter how or how ancient or deeply rooted, eventually faces a moment when it becomes obsolete. Sometimes customs end with dramatic pronouncements, laws are passed, edicts are issued, the old ways are formally abolished. But more often traditions simply fade away, becoming less common year by year, generation by generation, until one day people realize that what was once universal has become rare, and then finally extinct. The bedding ceremony died this second way through gradual abandonment rather than sudden prohibition. But that slow death has a story worth telling, because understanding how and why this custom disappeared reveals profound truths about how societies change, how new values replace old ones, and how even the most intimate aspects of human life are shaped by forces far larger than individual choice. The beginning of the end can be traced to the mid-1600s, though few people at the time would have recognized it as such. Bedding ceremonies were still common, still expected, still performed across Europe. But cracks were appearing in the foundation that had supported this custom for centuries. The first major crack was philosophical. The Enlightenment, that great flowering of rational thought and humanist values, was beginning to reshape how educated Europeans thought about almost everything, including marriage and privacy. Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke in England wrote about natural rights, inherent freedoms that belong to individuals simply by virtue of being human. Among these rights, Locke argued, was the right to personal liberty and control over one's own body. When you extend this logic to marriage, the implications are clear. If you have sovereignty over your own body, then surely your most intimate moments should be yours to control. Witnesses to consummation start to look less like legal protection and more like violation of natural rights. These philosophical arguments were initially confined to university halls and intellectual circles. Common people were not reading Locke's treatises, but ideas have a way of filtering down through society, changing attitudes slowly but surely. A university-educated son returns to his family's estate with new ideas about individual dignity. A merchant who attends philosophical lectures in the city comes home with different assumptions about privacy. A priest who has studied modern theology in seminary brings new perspectives to his parish. Each of these individuals becomes a small vector for cultural change. The second crack in the foundation was legal. Throughout the 1600s and accelerating in the 1700s, European states were developing increasingly sophisticated systems of record-keeping and documentation. Parish registers became more thorough and standardized. Births, marriages, and deaths were recorded with increasing care and detail. Property transactions were documented, filed, stored in organized archives. The entire legal infrastructure of European society was becoming more bureaucratic, more dependent on written records rather than oral testimony. This bureaucratic revolution had profound implications for bedding ceremonies. Remember, the primary purpose of witnesses was to create human testimony that could be used if the marriage was ever challenged. But if you have a marriage certificate signed by a priest and 2 witnesses, officially recorded in a parish register that is maintained by the church and recognized by the state, do you really need additional witnesses to the bedding? The legal function that bedding ceremonies served was being replaced by paperwork. Not immediately, of course. Legal systems are conservative institutions, slow to change. For decades, even centuries in some regions, both systems existed side by side, the old system of witnessed bedding and the new system of documented registration. But gradually the new system proved more reliable and less invasive. A marriage certificate could not die or change its story like a human witness might. A parish register could be consulted decades later without having to track down elderly witnesses. The bureaucratic system was simply more efficient, and efficiency has a way of winning out over tradition. The third crack was economic and social, the rise of what historians call companionate marriage, a new understanding of what marriage should be. For most of medieval history, marriage had been understood primarily as an economic and political arrangement. Love might develop between spouses, and that was nice, but it was not the point. The point was alliance, property transfer, continuation of family lines. But beginning in the late 1600s and accelerating through the 1700s and 1800s, a new model emerged, particularly among the middle classes. Marriage in this new understanding should be based on mutual affection, on companionship, on romantic love. This shift had enormous implications for bedding ceremonies. If marriage is primarily a business arrangement between families, then having the community witness its consummation makes sense. It is quality control, ensuring the contract is fulfilled. But if marriage is primarily a love relationship between 2 individuals, then community witnessing becomes invasive interference in something deeply personal. The new romantic ideal of marriage had no place for crowds in the bedroom. The wedding night should belong to the lovers alone, a precious private moment of intimacy and discovery. We can track this shift through literature. 18th century novels and plays begin to depict bedding ceremonies, when they mention them at all, as old-fashioned embarrassments that sensitive people try to avoid. Characters who insist on traditional bedding ceremonies are portrayed as crude, backward, out of touch with modern sensibilities. Young couples who manage to avoid the ceremony are depicted as clever and romantic, escaping an ordeal rather than fulfilling a duty. Popular culture was reflecting and reinforcing changing attitudes. The fourth crack was architectural. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves emphasis. The physical structure of European homes was changing dramatically during this period. In 1600, even wealthy families often had houses where privacy was limited, where servants and family members had access to most spaces, where the modern concept of a private bedroom was rare. By 1800, the middle and upper classes were living in houses that look much more familiar to modern eyes. Houses with hallways and separate rooms, with bedrooms that were genuinely private spaces, with doors that locked. Once you have a house designed around privacy, bedding ceremonies become architecturally awkward. The whole flow of the house is designed to separate public from private space to give family members their own territories. Filling a private bedroom with guests violates the logic of the architecture itself. And as more families lived in these newer, privacy-oriented houses, bedding ceremonies felt increasingly out of place, like trying to perform a medieval ritual in a modern setting where it simply did not fit. The fifth crack was religious, specifically the long-term effects of the Protestant Reformation. Protestant theology emphasized personal faith over communal ritual, direct relationship with God over church-mediated sacraments. These theological shifts had social implications that took generations to fully manifest. If your faith is personal and internal, if the important religious moments happen in your heart rather than in public ceremonies, then maybe your marriage should be personal too. Maybe what matters is the commitment between you, your spouse, and God, not the validation of witnesses. Protestant regions did not immediately abandon bedding ceremonies. We have records of them continuing well into the 1700s, even in staunchly Protestant areas. But Protestant culture created an intellectual and spiritual environment where the ceremony made less sense, where it seemed like an unnecessary elaboration, where the fundamental Protestant instinct to strip away excess ritual eventually turned against this tradition as well. By the early 1700s, these 5 cracks, philosophical, legal, social, architectural, and religious, were combining to create real pressure on the bedding ceremony tradition. But the custom did not collapse all at once. Instead, what happened was a gradual stratification. The ceremony began to disappear first among certain groups and in certain places, while persisting in others. Urban educated elites were the first to abandon bedding ceremonies. By the 1720s and 1730s, in cities like London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Edinburgh, fashionable society considered bedding ceremonies hopelessly old-fashioned. To have a traditional bedding ceremony marked you as provincial, as someone who did not understand modern manners. The social pressure among this class shifted from pressure to have the ceremony to pressure to not have it. An aristocratic couple in 1730s London would likely have no bedding ceremony, or at most a highly abbreviated symbolic version with just a couple of trusted witnesses for legal formality. The rural nobility and gentry were slower to change. They lived in traditional manners, often in isolated areas, still closely connected to traditional ways of life. For them, bedding ceremonies continued through much of the 1700s, though they became less elaborate over time. A country squire in 1760 might still have a bedding ceremony, but it would be shorter, less public, more focused on legal witnessing than social celebration. The invasive aspects were being quietly minimized even as the basic structure remained. The merchant and artisan classes in towns varied widely. Some, particularly those in larger cities or those with cosmopolitan connections, adopted the elite pattern of abandoning the ceremony. Others, especially in smaller towns or more traditional regions, maintained bedding ceremonies well into the 1800s. This class was caught between worlds, aspiring to genteel respectability, which increasingly meant no bedding ceremony, but also tied to traditional guild customs and community expectations that still valued the ceremony. The peasantry, the vast majority of Europe's population, continued bedding ceremonies longest of all. In remote rural areas, particularly in regions with strong local traditions, parts of Scandinavia, rural Ireland, isolated alpine villages, parts of Eastern Europe, simplified versions of bedding ceremonies continued into the 1800s and in a few isolated cases even into the early 1900s. These were no longer the elaborate ceremonies of earlier centuries, just a few witnesses to fulfill custom and provide some legal protection, but they demonstrated the tremendous staying power of tradition in communities that changed slowly. By the mid-1800s, the bedding ceremony was essentially extinct in most of Western Europe, at least in its traditional form. The last documented formal bedding ceremony in the English royal family appears to be in the late 1700s. The last recorded Parisian noble bedding ceremony seems to be in the early 1700s. German cities had mostly abandoned the custom by the mid-1800s. The custom had gone from universal to rare in the span of about 150 years, remarkably fast for such a deeply entrenched tradition, but also remarkably slow when you consider how invasive and uncomfortable the ceremony had become by modern standards. What replaced bedding ceremonies? Interestingly, many of the social functions they had served found new expressions. The desire for community celebration of marriage remained, so wedding receptions became more elaborate, with toasts and speeches and collective festivities that validated the marriage without invading the couple's privacy. The legal need for witnesses was satisfied by marriage certificates and official registration. The symbolic transition from single to married life found new expressions in other wedding customs: tossing the bouquet, the bride throwing her garter, cutting the wedding cake together. These rituals marked the marriage as a significant moment worthy of community attention, but they respected the couple's privacy in ways bedding ceremonies never could. There is something poignant about tracking the death of a custom like this. For centuries, bedding ceremonies had been how Europeans validated marriages, how they made the transition from individual to couple, how they involved communities in the most intimate moments of life. Millions of people across hundreds of generations had experienced these ceremonies, and then, relatively quickly, the custom simply stopped. The last generation to practice it probably did not realize they were the last. They just knew that their children were doing things differently, that the world was changing, that old ways were giving way to new. And in the end, almost no one mourned the passing of bedding ceremonies. Unlike some traditions whose loss is lamented, whose disappearance is seen as a tragedy of modernity erasing meaningful custom, the bedding ceremony died unmissed. By the time it was truly gone, the idea seemed so invasive, so embarrassing, so incompatible with modern values that people could barely understand how their ancestors had ever tolerated it. The custom had become incomprehensible, and incomprehensible customs do not survive. But the story of the bedding ceremony's decline and fall is not just about one custom ending. It is about a fundamental transformation in how Western societies understood privacy, individuality, marriage, and community. The forces that killed the bedding ceremony, Enlightenment philosophy, bureaucratic record-keeping, romantic ideals of marriage, architectural privacy, Protestant individualism, these same forces reshaped virtually every aspect of life. The disappearance of bedding ceremonies was just one visible symptom of much larger changes that created the modern world we now inhabit. And so, having watched this custom rise, flourish, and finally fade into history, having understood it from every angle, legal, religious, social, psychological, regional, we are ready for the final question. What does all of this mean for us today? What can this strange, uncomfortable, fascinating medieval custom teach us about our own lives, our own assumptions, our own customs that might someday seem as incomprehensible to our descendants as bedding ceremonies seem to us. Let us turn now to the lessons and reflections that this historical journey offers to those of us living in a very different world. Here we are, at the end of a long journey through one of history's most uncomfortable customs. We have watched medieval couples being paraded to beds by crowds of witnesses. We have stood outside Icelandic bedchambers counting slowly in the cold. We have witnessed kings refusing tradition and peasants adapting it to their means. We have seen a practice that lasted for centuries finally crumble under the weight of changing values. And now, as you lie here listening in the quiet darkness of your own private bedroom, a privacy that would have seemed miraculous to most of our ancestors, the question arises, so what? What does any of this matter to us, living in a world so utterly different from medieval Europe that bedding ceremonies seem like something from an alien planet? The answer, I think, is that studying customs that seem incomprehensible helps us understand something crucial about ourselves. How much of what we consider natural and obvious is actually cultural and temporary? The medieval people who participated in bedding ceremonies were not stupid or insensitive. They were responding rationally to their world, to their social structures, to their understanding of marriage and community. And we, living in our privacy-focused, individualistic society, are also responding to our world, following customs that make sense to us, but that might seem equally bizarre to people living a few centuries from now. Let us start with the most obvious lesson. Privacy is not a universal human need, it is a culturally constructed value. For most of human history, for most human societies, privacy as we understand it simply did not exist. People lived communally, worked communally, even slept communally. The idea that you need your own room, your own space, your own time alone would have seemed strange and even suspicious to the vast majority of humans who have ever lived. Our modern obsession with privacy, our assumption that it is a fundamental right, is historically unusual. This does not mean privacy is bad or that we should abandon it. Privacy has brought genuine benefits. It protects us from intrusion, gives us space for reflection and intimacy, allows us to develop as individuals rather than just as community members. But recognizing that privacy is a cultural value, rather than a natural law, should make us more thoughtful about it. When do we need privacy, and when does excessive privacy isolate us? How do we balance our need for personal space with our need for community connection? These are questions every modern person navigates, often without realizing we are navigating them. The bedding ceremony also teaches us about the relationship between law and social custom. Medieval people needed witnesses to consummation because their legal system relied on oral testimony rather than written documentation. They had found a solution to a real problem. How do you prove something happened when you have no photographs, no video, no comprehensive written records? Their solution, from their perspective, made perfect sense. It was invasive, yes, but it was reliable. We have different solutions to the same underlying problem. We prove things happen through digital records, through photographs, through electronic paper trails that document nearly everything we do. Our solutions create their own invasions: surveillance cameras, data collection, digital tracking. Someone from medieval Europe might look at our world and be horrified by how much of our lives is recorded and stored. You let corporations track your every movement through your phone, they might ask. You allow cameras to watch you in public spaces. You voluntarily post intimate details of your life online where anyone can see them. From their perspective, our privacy invasions might seem worse than theirs, just differently arranged. This is not to say medieval bedding ceremonies and modern surveillance are equivalent, but it reminds us that every society accepts certain invasions and rejects others, and what seems acceptable depends heavily on cultural context and perceived benefits. We tolerate invasions we understand and that serve purposes we value, and we are horrified by invasions that violate our particular cultural sensibilities. Understanding this helps us be more thoughtful about which invasions we accept and why. The bedding ceremony also reveals something about the changing nature of marriage itself. Medieval marriage was fundamentally a social institution, a public matter, something that involved families and communities and had implications far beyond the couple themselves. Modern marriage is fundamentally personal, a private bond between two individuals based on love and mutual choice. Neither model is inherently superior. They serve different social needs and reflect different values. But the shift from public to private marriage has had consequences we are still grappling with. When marriage was primarily a community affair, couples had immense social support. If your marriage struggled, the whole community had a stake in helping you fix it because your marriage was their business. When marriage became primarily personal, couples gained freedom, but lost that safety net. Now when marriages struggle, couples are often alone with their problems, expected to work things out privately, without community intervention or support. Some of the loneliness of modern marriage, the sense that you are on your own, is the price we pay for the privacy we value. Perhaps there is something to learn from the medieval model without adopting its invasive aspects. Modern couples might benefit from more community involvement in their marriages, not witnesses in the bedroom obviously, but mentorship from older couples, support systems that help marriages thrive, community celebrations that reinforce the bond. We have perhaps swung too far toward the private extreme, and finding some middle ground might serve as well. The bedding ceremony also teaches us about consent and power. Medieval brides and grooms rarely had full control over their weddings, their marriages, or their bodies. They submitted to bedding ceremonies not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice, because social pressure and legal requirements left them no alternative. Looking back on this from our perspective, with our modern emphasis on consent and bodily autonomy, we can see how wrong that was, how much those people's dignity was violated even though they might not have had the conceptual framework to recognize the violation. This should make us wonder, what are we doing right now? What invasions or indignities are we accepting that future generations will look back on with the same horror we feel toward bedding ceremonies? Are there ways we violate people's autonomy or dignity that we do not even recognize because they are so normalized in our culture? History suggests the answer is almost certainly yes. Every generation thinks it has achieved enlightenment, that it has overcome the barbarism of the past, and every generation is eventually proven wrong. Humility about our own potential blind spots is one of history's most valuable lessons. There is also something to learn from how bedding ceremonies ended. They did not disappear because a king issued a decree or a church council banned them. They disappeared because individuals, one by one, decided they did not want to participate anymore. King Charles III barring his bedroom door, couples negotiating for fewer witnesses, families quietly having less elaborate ceremonies than their parents did. Small acts of resistance accumulated over generations into complete cultural transformation. This pattern of change, gradual, individual, accumulating into collective transformation, is how most deep cultural change happens. We often imagine change coming from above, from laws and leaders, but real lasting change comes from below, from millions of small decisions by ordinary people. If you want to change your culture, the lesson of the bedding ceremony is start with yourself. Make the changes you want to see. Accept that you might face social pressure, that change will be slow, that you might not live to see the full transformation. But trust that if enough people make similar choices, culture will eventually shift. The regional variations in bedding ceremonies teach us about the beautiful diversity of human culture. Even within Christian Europe, Even with a shared religious framework, different regions adapted this custom in wildly different ways. Icelanders counting to 1,000 in the cold, Norwegians offering ceremonial foods, Irish brides protected against fairies, German wedding fools leading parades, French elegance, Spanish religiosity, Italian civic participation. The same basic custom, 1,000 different expressions. In our globalized world where cultures are blending and many traditions are disappearing, this reminder of diversity feels precious. There is no one right way to mark important life transitions. Different cultures have found different solutions, each valid in its own context. As we navigate between cultural homogenization on one hand and rigid traditionalism on the other, perhaps the bedding ceremony's flexibility offers a model. Keep the core purpose, in their case validating marriages, in modern weddings celebrating commitment, but adapt the expression to local values and conditions. Honor tradition while allowing evolution. And finally, the bedding ceremony teaches us about the necessity of incomprehensibility. Some customs must become incomprehensible before they can die. As long as we can understand why our ancestors did something, even if we disagree with it, the practice retains some legitimacy. But once a custom crosses into the realm of the truly incomprehensible, once we cannot even imagine the mindset that would consider it acceptable, then it loses all hold on us. Bedding ceremonies reached that point. They became so alien to modern sensibilities that they simply could not survive. This suggests that for harmful customs to truly end, they need to become not just unacceptable but unthinkable. It is not enough to say we should not do this. We need to reach a point where the idea is so foreign that people cannot imagine why anyone ever would do it. This has implications for modern social justice work, for efforts to end practices we now consider harmful. The goal is not just policy change but consciousness change, not just making something illegal, but making it incomprehensible. So here we are, lying in our private bedrooms, masters of our own intimate lives in ways our ancestors could barely imagine. We have gained something precious, dignity, autonomy, privacy, but we've also lost something, community involvement, social support, the sense that our important moments are shared experiences. Neither the medieval world nor our modern one has everything right. Both have made trade-offs, accepting some problems to gain other benefits. Perhaps the wisest approach is to study history, not to judge but to understand, not to condemn our ancestors, but to recognize their humanity and their rationality within their own context. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge and social structures they had. We are doing the same, and people a few centuries from now will likely look at some of our practices with the same bemused horror we feel toward bedding ceremonies, wondering how we could ever have thought that was acceptable. The bedding ceremony, in all its uncomfortable glory, reminds us that we are not the endpoint of human cultural evolution. We are just another point along a long journey. Our customs are not permanent and inevitable. They are temporary and contingent, shaped by forces we barely understand, destined to be replaced by new customs that our descendants will consider obvious and natural, but that might seem as strange to us as bedding ceremonies seem now. And perhaps that is the final, deepest lesson: humility. Humility about our own practices and values. Humility about our ability to judge the past. Humility about our confidence that we have achieved some kind of moral enlightenment that previous generations lacked. We are all products of our time, doing our best to navigate circumstances we did not create, following customs that feel natural but are actually constructed, believing things that future generations will question. The medieval couple, lying in bed while witnesses stood nearby, probably did not think about any of this. They were just trying to get through an uncomfortable but expected ritual, to start their married life, to meet their social obligations, And we, lying in our private beds listening to stories about them, are also just trying to navigate our own rituals and obligations, our own social expectations, our own uncomfortable moments. The specifics have changed. The human experience, trying to build lives and relationships within the constraints and possibilities our culture offers us, remains surprisingly constant. So as we come to the end of this long night's journey through the strange world of medieval bedding ceremonies, take a moment to appreciate your private bedroom, your autonomy over your intimate life, the dignity that privacy provides. But also remember the community and connection that medieval people had, the social support that came with their communal way of life. Perhaps we can find ways to have both: privacy when we need it, community when we want it, autonomy with connection rather than isolation. Thank you for staying with me through this exploration of one of history's most uncomfortable customs. Thank you for being willing to look at something strange and challenging, and to find lessons and insights in it. Thank you for your patience with the awkwardness and your openness to understanding a world so different from our own. I hope this journey has given you not just historical knowledge, but also some new perspectives on your own life, your own values, your own assumptions about what is natural and inevitable. Sleep well in your private bed, in your private room, in your private life. And when you wake, perhaps carry with you a bit of the humility and curiosity that history can teach us. Remember that what seems obvious to you is not obvious to everyone, that what seems permanent is actually temporary, that what seems natural is actually cultural. And keep listening, keep learning, keep exploring the strange and wonderful ways humans have organized their lives across time and space. Until our next journey together through history's fascinating stories, rest peacefully. The witnesses have long since gone home, the curtains are finally closed, and the wedding night, after all these centuries, belongs only to those who live it. Good night.